a cursory familiarity with
Uh-huh.
various things ancient, and
Uh-huh.
the topic array was enough probably. But
And what's with that talismanic publishing? Are you on some sort of a cult kick or something?
oh no, but I'm just going with what's in the news, and I'm
Okay.
I'm just seeing things in the news that fit together that the news isn't fitting together, and asking you about the possible connections between them, because that's not the only topic related to that that's in the news. But not everybody, reporters tend to work on their piece and their beat, and so they don't necessarily look at.
So you're tying all this archaeology stuff to what's going on in the news right now?
Oh yes,
Okay.
potentially.
Okay.
But I thought we would kick it off with a little.
Oh, do we have to go there? Come
No,
on.
it was just a passing thought that I had when I was looking at the Las Vegas shooting, because I thought, as horrible as that is, I don't like country music either, and I can understand how someone might react, but there does seem to be a lot of planning involved, so. And why not a Miley Cyrus concert? Not to give anybody any ideas, but yeah.
No, definitely not. Please.
But I'm not that came up during my research for the show notes, and I thought, I've never listened to a Jason Aldean song. I always hit mute when he's on like Saturday Night Live or something, and as I do with almost all the musical acts they have. Just get back to Weekend Update. Come on, but. I didn't make it through this one either. I heard 20 seconds of it. That's all I needed. I was done.
Wait a minute. Have we started?
Oh yeah, we're in.
Okay.
Welcome to the show, Dr. Farrell.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I've been awake a long time. I
figured. But no, I mean, you before the show, you went. Took your break, and the cowboy hat also. As I say, I see connections in things, and
yes,
Vegas, the cowboy hat, and I was just paying attention to the pinhole camera thing in the shooter's room, and not one of our topics today, but it got me interested. Okay, so he had pinhole cameras, and he drilled these little holes, and he was watching the hallway and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Interesting take. So. No, but Dr. Farrell, I do have a lot of questions today, and most of the questions revolve around ancient civilizations, the occult, and the space race. And so there will probably be that many segments of the show. So a little lighthearted country music. Actually, that's just horrible stuff. I hated to do that to both of us, but no offense to those of you who love Jason Aldean. I just can't do it. I'd rather hear sitar music simultaneously with an ancient Korean pansori opera, I think, while Klingons chant their war cry.
No, thank you. Jeez,
I can, and mix in a little Schoenberg, and you really got something.
Yeah.
As repulsive as it might be, I still can handle it over Jason Aldean. All right, so ancient civilizations. So for me, the centerpiece of today's show is an article that you sussed out in Scientific American. And this is about a question that came up in discussion that the scientists, to their credit, took quite seriously, which is, thermal signatures, hyperthermals indicate that we've experienced global warming that was catastrophic and potentially an extinction level event other times. And so
I blogged about that.
You blogged about that. And so it would be very interesting to wonder if there had been ancient industrial civilizations that were related to this. Now, some people, of course, use that to say, oh, it's nothing to worry about. It's happened before. But the problem is we don't really want extinction level events, even if they have happened before. That's not something we're happy to find out. That's comforting in the last moment as your city burns. Well, it's happened before. Yeah. But it does raise a number of interesting questions, such as, who survived and where did we come from? But the question that came out of that article, which we'll link for those who didn't read the main blog post, you should, but we'll link it to these show notes as well, is, well, how would we know? How would we know if there were ancient civilizations? And this is actually a plausible question because the obvious answer would be, well, wouldn't we be digging them up? But actually, the scientists said no. And so here's the quote from the article. Today, less than 1% of the Earth's surface is urbanized, and the chance that any of our great civilizations would remain over tens of millions of years is vanishingly low, says so-and-so, a geologist, etc. A metropolis's ultimate fate, he notes, mostly depends on whether the surrounding surface is subsiding to be locked in rock or rising to be eroded away by the rain and wind. New Orleans, for example, is sinking. San Francisco is rising, he says. So the French Quarter, it seems, has a much better chance of entering the geological record than, say, Haight-Ashbury, which I'm okay with also, among other things. But to estimate the odds of finding artifacts, he says the back of the envelope calculation for dinosaur fossils says that one fossil emerges every 10,000 years. Dinosaur footprints are rarer still. So for every 10,000 years of record, we might have one fossil. That's my summary. After a couple of million years, to finish up, he says the chances are that any physical reminder of your civilization has vanished. So you have to search for things like sedimentary anomalies or isotopic ratios that look off. The shadows of many pre-human civilizations could, in principle, lurk hidden in such subtleties. So one thinks, for instance, that there's a lot of research into Arctic ice cores, that Arctic ice cores could be a clue if we asked the right question, if we did not assume the absence of ancient industrial society.
Right.
And so one of the articles I sent you earlier was lead pollution trapped Greenland ice shows rise and fall of ancient societies. But what it means by ancient isn't what these guys mean by ancient. Ancient can, to some people, mean 1,500 years ago. So I found that interesting, and I found another less impactful part of the article even more interesting. So first, there's the concept that an ancient civilization might actually best be detected not by digging it up, but by chemical signatures found in ice and in soil sediment and so on. So that's interesting. And then the second thing is this quote. I find it amazing that no one has worked all this out before, and I'm really glad that somebody's taken a closer look at it, says, again, this is Jason Wright, who last year published a fluffy little paper, quote unquote, exploring the counterintuitive notion that the best place to find evidence of any of Earth's putative pre-human civilizations may well be off-world. If, for instance, dinosaurs built interplanetary rockets, presumably some remnants of the activity might remain preserved in stable orbits or on the surfaces of more geologically inert celestial bodies, such as the moon. In other words, look for the satellites that the ancient civilization launched, whether they're dead or floating, and then you've got evidence of an ancient civilization. So, and again, one might question, do we know what we're looking for? What form would those satellites take, and so on? But I found that interesting. So you're with me thus far. This is what you blogged about. But here's my question, the place where I got stopped. So for me, the biggest problem is not actually chemical signatures or things out in space. It's another assumption that we have, or a question that we don't really have fully answered, which is how old is man? Because the normal record says man is only 10,000 years old. And so, and yet I sent you another article that I found an interesting statement. It was about, they had dug up in China a fossil they thought is a 25,000-year-old person. And this person they thought was a cross between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, but turned out not to be. They had like as much Neanderthal DNA as I do, but they were, which is a lot, but they were, but they were hairy back, But they were, they were saying that they checked for this other species of ancient man, and that it didn't have that either. And what I thought interesting about that is they said that they checked for this other species of extinct ancient man. And I thought, well, but when I grew up, man was only Homo sapiens. And part of the evolution debate was that's what we mean by man. Other species that have died out are not man, which seemed to me to be, and to a lot of people to be semantic. But now it seems that science is treating this as though that assumption is not true, that there are ancient species of man that are a different species than us, but are still man, which again sounds semantic, but still interesting semantics, like that they are choosing to think about the problem differently when they don't feel sort of under siege by creationism. And so I have a couple of questions. One is, it strikes me as odd that science would arrive at this notion that man is only 10,000 years old when it keeps digging up fossils that are much older than that. And when that number strikes me as suspiciously similar to what biblical timelines would seem to support, as though the starting place, as much as they might deny it, were almost an assumption having to do with a particular reading of biblical texts, and therefore, in some ways, a rejection of other ancient texts. So a preeminence, one might say, of biblical texts. So question number one is that correct? Is there a subtle, hidden presumption around a certain reading of biblical text at lurk in the most atheistic archaeological science that we have, and at the expense of other ancient texts, of which there's an even more enormous bias, versus the bias that is supposedly there about biblical texts? In other words, are people who have alternate views protesting the wrong thing when they say you're not reading the Bible, and they should be saying you should be reading ancient Sumerian texts, which indicate man is much older? So that's question one. And I have other questions about this, but in this first part, question two is why when we keep finding examples of men older than 10,000 years, unless I'm just not reading the latest thing, does the mainline assumption that man is about 10,000 years old, why is that still lasting, given that we also recognize they're extinct species that we now call man?
Oh, wow. Good questions. Let me begin with a slight modification to what you've presented. As far as I know, when you said that they're saying that man is 10,000 years old, I think what you are probably meaning to say is civilization, or some indication of civilized man, is about 10,000 years old.
Yeah, because man that isn't dragging the knuckles and living in
right. Which I think there's a lot of evidence for. I mean, you've got the Indus Valley civilization, which is approximately, I think they're dating it to about 8,000 BC. You've got other places in South America that they've dated a little older than that, around circa 10,000. So I think that's probably what they're saying. The other part of this is the genetic theory that I wrote about in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men at some length, is oddly correlative to the Sumerian kings list, to the Egyptian kings list, which indicate, the way the Sumerians put it, kingship came down from heaven approximately 240,000 years ago. The Egyptian text is a little later than that, not that much, but let's say circa 250 to 225,000 years ago for the rise of, in the text, the rise of man. Then you have the geneticists that are tracing haplogroups through mitochondrial DNA, which they're tracing back to what they call mitochondrial Eve, which is about, again, if my memory serves me correctly, about 220 to 240,000 years ago. So the odd thing there is the ancient texts and those kings lists seem oddly to correlate with things that scientists are talking about. The intriguing question to me, the way you put it, is that the chronology that they're presenting with this 10,000 years is almost biblical, because that, as far as I know, that 10,000 years ago date is pretty much the agreed upon date within alternative scholarship and some conservative Christian biblical scholarship for the flood. So they're
Well, isn't
dating,
it also Ice Age?
yeah, Ice Age to about 10,000 BC, the flood. So this is all connected in their thinking. And what I'm suspicious of, like you, Daniel, is that this could be a kind of it's one of two things. The way the way I'm looking at it, it's either some sort of residual cultural influence of the biblical text, which is so central to our civilization, or we're looking at some sort of scientific version of a limited hangout position. In other words, a fallback position, which is kind of the way I tend to view it, because when that article appeared and so many people saw it and sent it to me, I was kind of stunned that Scientific American would even touch the topic. So something has changed. There's been some sort of paradigm shift or something that has either compelled them to come out with this idea or to entertain this. And what's absent, from what I can tell in a lot of this mainstream revisionism, if I can put it that way, is I don't see an attempt by these people to correlate it outside of their disciplines. The other thing that I found very interesting, since we're talking about that article, that really kind of grabbed me, was they were using, by their own admission, and I think they stated this fairly explicitly, they were using the template of contemporary industrialized civilizations, say from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around the turn of the 18th century up to the present, as the template by which to gauge things. And in that respect, they were positing a kind of a similar sort of fossil fuel-based economy, fossil fuel-based energy system, and so on and so forth. From everything that I've researched myself on these ancient civilizations, I don't see in the text, I don't see a physics that supports that. And again, it's all speculation, because I'm arguing a very different sort of physics than our contemporary physics in some respects, not all respects. So I do question the assumption of the template, although I do think they have a major point that when you look at the inhabited surface of the Earth, it's very small compared to the overall surface of the Earth. And I think they make a very good point that any evidence for such a past civilization would be very, very small, the possibility of it surviving, which is basically what we see from those ancient civilizations. Places like Pumupunku or Mohenjo-Daro, some of these very, very old sites, they're very rare, they're very scarce. Clearly there was something, but two places on the surface of the entire planet does not make a civilization. So to me, I think you're right. I think there's some sort of residual cultural dating that I think we're picking up from the culture. But I do also think that science now is under pressure from decades of research in the alternative community. It's beginning to pressure them into modifying their worldview and taking some of these questions into account, which I think is a good thing. It's been long overdue. And as far as I'm concerned, it's only going to enhance the discussion. It's not going to make it go away. But I think it's good that these people are getting, jumping on the bandwagon and starting to get involved with these questions.
Well, I can't remember the name of the Roman Catholic timeline of scripture that was so prevalent for like a century. Do you remember the one I mean?
You're thinking Anglican. It was Archbishop Usher.
Yeah, Usher's time.
Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah. So I'm always suspicious of what I would call the dispensational side of evangelical
I am too.
thinking, because I spent some time there, and it bears every resemblance to some of the cults that we had talked about before in many of its implementations. I don't mean that every little old lady that has a Schofield Bible is involved in a cult. So we don't want to stretch what I'm saying. But I got particularly suspicious about it during the Iraq War when it was uncovered that there were teams of soldiers who were sort of collaborating on a very apocalyptic dispensational view and using it as sort of motivation for attacks on civilians and things like that. And it freaked me the heck out. And so I get suspicious when I see the earmarks of something like that. And I can't help but feel whenever I hear the 10K number that I'm almost listening to Usher's chronology. So because there's this massive jump. So the assumption is that what we call man biologically is 200, 300,000 years old.
Right.
And we say that because we have fossils and we have, evident, that's basically it. It's the biological material that we have. And we do see little bits of clothing and other things like that. But at the point that we define man in the modern sense, that's about 10 to 50,000 years. And at that point, it's because, we have sewing needles at 50,000 years. We have art, musical instruments, deep sea fishing at 40,000 years. We have domesticated dogs and animals at 30,000 years. Right. And it's at this mark of about 10 or 11,000 years that you see domesticated cattle and the rise of Jericho, an identifiable city, which is the oldest continuously inhabited city on the planet. And so I feel like I'm detecting a proto-religious or perhaps putatively or secretly religious assumption in the work of what seem to be non-religious scientists.
I agree with you. May I
figure out why it's there?
may I interrupt? I had the same feeling reading that article. For many of the same reasons that you do. I couldn't help but connect it to my my thesis or hypothesis that many of these people are following very covertly a dispensationalist plan, if I can put it that way. You put me on to the work of Jeff Sharlet some years ago, and I read those books, and you have a number of congressmen and senators in both parties. You have a number of military people that have subscribed essentially to that worldview, but nonetheless, they're also subscribing to a very peculiar religious agenda to try and amalgamate the three Abrahamic or Yahwist religions. And that scares me. The other thing that really bothered me, Daniel, about that article was there was no reference to the timelines of other cultures, in particular the Vedic or the Hindu culture, which is very, very different timeline than our own. It would be much more in keeping with the Babylonian, Sumerian, Egyptian sorts of timelines. But there is a famous work. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a work called Forbidden Archaeology. It's a big, thick book about that thick, written by Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson. And both of these gentlemen are Hindus. They're practicing Hindus, but they went and uncovered just a massive amount of archaeological evidence of things that are even older than the Cro-Magnon remains that you referred to, the artworks dating from about 40,000 years ago. They found coins in sediment that were clearly milled. In other words, they'd been through a die press like our modern coins, that were in a stratigraphy layer of about 250,000 years ago. And obviously the coin was vastly eroded, but it was nevertheless clearly a coin. So something existed here. And I'm for the same reason wary of this dating that they've resorted to. It's as if they paid a little bow to some of the research of the alternative community, but in doing so, they didn't reference where that date is coming from. So they're picking all of this stuff up, and they're not referencing the sources of where it came from, and that makes me suspicious. It looks to me like I suspect that what they're trying to do is reassert, just like I blogged about in that blog, it looks to me like they're trying to reassert a little influence or control over the narrative again. And they're trying to control it in a particularly, let's call it crypto-biblical way, for want of a better expression. But yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I had the exact same feeling.
Well, yeah, so it's sort of a sense of something that might be there. And of course, I've dug up things to ask you about that seem to suggest that it might be more than a sense. So I'll bring them up in this show. But so here's some other clues that I sort of put together. So, so we talked about the different periods, and I said, okay, the assumption of man is 200 to 300K. That's when you get mitochondrial Eve and chromosome.
Now, may I interrupt again?
Yeah.
I want to remind people, if they haven't read Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, that there's a problem that geneticists are not talking about. And that is when they did a similar study of Y chromosomal Adam, and sampling male haplogroups all over the world, the Orient, Europe, Latin America, and so on, they discovered that human males, the modern human male, carries a Y chromosome that predates, listen to this is wild, that predates the rise of modern man by about 100,000 years. So in other words, Y chromosomal Adam predates mitochondrial Eve by about 100,000 years. Now, I find that extraordinarily interesting, again, because the Sumerian texts in particular suggest that, when the Anunnaki or the Nephilim, or whatever you wish to call them, engaged in their genetic engineering experiment, they took 14 hominid females, let's call them Homo sapiens, but not Homo sapiens sapiens, not the species, but the genus. And then that was the human element that contributed to modern man. And then they took one male donor from the divine side of things, and that's how it got here. In other words, that's the way the Sumerian texts present this. And I thought that, again, that's very interesting, because genetics is loosely correlating what the text is saying. So again, they're not talking about all of this. Anyway, I'm sorry about the interruption. I just wanted to put that out there as yet another problem that they're not talking about. But anyway, go ahead.
Plug the book. And plug
and plug the book, yes.
Yes. But, well, I mean, it's coincidentally, there's an article in Vox that talks about the story of human evolution in Africa is undergoing a major rewrite. And it basically says, we thought that man emerged 200,000 years ago, but now in Ethiopia, we found 300,000-year-old man. We're looking at something, but we don't know what it is. Is literally what the article says, and in the words of the scientists. And so, but the course, it keeps shifting, it keeps moving. But these assumption, I mean, it's different than when I was a kid too.
Yes.
The assumption is that man, the monkey, is 200,000 or 300,000 years old, man, the ape. But there is this jump, this weird jump that happens between what they call, the upper Paleolithic period, and which starts at 50,000 years ago, and the middle Paleolithic period, which starts 200,000 years ago. And obviously, the normal story for that is, well, we just don't have enough fossil evidence. It's too old to find, which I find difficult to swallow, simply because it isn't how old it is, it's how it's preserved that determines whether you find it.
Right.
So I'm uncomfortable with just the bare notion that because the stuff supposedly from the middle Paleolithic period, when man was dragging his knuckles, is not around, that man was either essentially monkey and did not live in cities, or that it's not available because it's old. So back to dispensationalism for a second, because I will tie this in later. Dispensationalism, it should be said, is a portable theoretical system. It does not require even Christianity.
Right, exactly.
So the dispensationalism of Joachim of Fiore, by which we get the three ages of ancient, medieval, and modern, might be called essentially a rogue occult dispensationalism within Roman Catholicism, and not something, although it became later standardized, but not something that at the time was necessarily sanctioned.
Bingo.
And certain forms of dispensationalism throughout the history of the church certainly have not been sanctioned, and do seem to crop up in non or quasi-Christian cults. And so you can take dispensationalism and pull it out and say it's just like whether or not you like Kool-Aid. You could be a Christian like Kool-Aid, or you don't have to. You could be an atheist and like Kool-Aid.
Right.
It's not required. One does not mandate the other. So that's the first point, is that we talk about this theory of how ages occur, whether they're ancient, medieval, modern, or whether they're middle Paleolithic, upper Paleolithic, or Mesolithic, and Neolithic and onward, that one could have a set of assumptions there that are quasi-religious, and the assumptions dictate your conclusions more than the evidence, perhaps, because the evidence is filtered through the array of assumptions.
The template, right, exactly.
So I can't help but pair that with a couple of other points. So scientific conclusions have a history of coming to scientific conclusions have a history of matching their sponsorship. Who is sponsoring the scientific exercise? But we like to think that scientists are independent and they come up with conclusions and take it or leave it. This is what we found, boss. Very often there's a selectivity that determines what evidence to look at and what evidence is significant versus what evidence is insignificant and anomalous. That depends on who's funding it. And that takes you back to that whole issue of, well, if funding is done by government and by private sector,
precisely,
then and perhaps by the military, then it is not. You can't believe that Himmler might have come back and said, based on our archaeological findings, we're not the super race, and that all people are basically genetically equal. He could not come back with that conclusion. So, and I don't mean to compare modern archaeology to the occult expeditions then. Though it does remind me of some of the stuff that happened during the Renaissance under the Medici. I can't help but notice, one, this jump from the point of the middle Paleolithic to the upper that seems unaccountable except by assumption. Secondly, I can't help but note that the assumptions seem to mirror an attitude about ages that is quasi-dispensational.
Yes,
in the way it looks. And third, I can't help but detect another assumption that I need to ask you about. And that assumption is this. So the first assumption I asked you about is the age of man. Do you see a kind of narrative here that wants to say, well, there's a biblical template or a quasi-biblical template? And you answered that. And the other thing that I find is almost too astounding to me to say, even though it's right in front of our eyes, there is this assumption that there is a single human source for all humans, a single mitochondrial and chromosomal even atom, single, and it shapes all of our research of migration patterns and our interpretation of the fossil record and our interpretation of these very ages in the age of man, because they must be telling us something that is related to what we've already found. It must fit into the template. And so my question is this. That is a quasi-religious assumption. Almost all what we call Western religions, but also many ancient religions, assume a single source for man. And regardless of whether or not we personally believe that or agree with that, why are atheistic scientists assuming the same thing? Why is that assumption there? Though the evidence seems to refute it, it seems to be the starting place before they look at the evidence and the template they're dropping over it, unless they're using some Usher-like quasi-religious template in their thinking before they even look at the data.
I think, I agree with you. I think it's a subliminal template
That's
that
what
they're not, yeah, that they're not even aware of. And again, I go back to the book that I referenced previously, Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson's Forbidden Archaeology. If you're not familiar with the book, get it and read it. There's a kind of a smaller adapted book that they summarize their 900-page monster in a much smaller book. But basically, what they argued in the book was that much of the archaeological evidence which they present is in the form of documents, texts, newspaper articles about these finds that they have traced back and verified and so on and so forth, and compiled this enormous database of anomalous archaeological data, like the coin that I referred to before. Or in the case of France, they found tubular bars, hollowed out bars of steel in stratigraphy in chalk mines in France that, if you accept the stratigraphic dating, were about 30 million years old. And clearly, clearly these steel things were very old and they were clearly machined. But things like this get forgotten or deliberately suppressed, is their argument, because it doesn't fit this Western quasi-religious subliminal template of how we're supposed to progress. The biggest problem that I think that these scientists have, whether they're, theists or agnostics or atheists, the biggest problem that I see that they have is that they are still adhering to this Western template of progress from, primitivism to modern society, where the record and the texts state that there was something very, very ancient and very sophisticated that, for whatever reason, depending on who you consult, died out, and we've been crawling back up to that level ever since then. So the assumption that the ancient texts make is not one of progress, it's one of catastrophic retrogression and a slow crawl back up to that level. So it's a devolutionary point of view rather than an evolutionary point of view in the modern Western sense. So yeah, I think there's been suppression. I think these people are working with a subliminal template that they're not even really aware of. And I do think some of them are probably aware of it, and what they're doing is they're trying to create a limited hangout position to regain control of the narrative. When you confront works like Cremo and Thompson, you're confronting a real scholarly tome, and the case is almost overwhelming that they make.
Well, all right, so let's deepen this a little more. So you heard me recall that, though we kind of disregard it as either anomalous or periodic, in that range of 30 to 50,000 years,
right?
We nonetheless do not regard the presence of art, even figurative art, the presence of organized deep sea fishing, the presence of the domestication of animals. For some reason, we seem to regard domestication of dogs as more primitive than domestication of cattle. So, if you've ever gone to the pound, you might change your mind. Cattle are called cows for a reason. They move, follow me around. It's not that hard. So I don't know, but I'd be interesting to find out when we think we domesticated sheep. But sheeple, as some people like to say. But what I notice is an assumption there. We do not regard the presence of art, music, deep sea fishing, which is an industry, and the domestication of animals as implying a level of human organization that is city-like,
right?
In the absence of the identifiable city in the record. So it takes us 20,000 years before we go, okay, now they've got Jericho, so now they are organized into cities. And I'm like, all right, that's just the one you found and you know about.
Right.
And my feeling is what is a city if it is not organized industry, domestication of animals, art, culture, and music?
Right.
Implying also some system of organization that is religious, governmental, or both. And one could dig into that, but if you were to consult social scientists, I don't think you get I don't think you get a living made out of these things where they need to trade with each other without a system of social organization that is exactly cosmopolitan.
Exactly.
So in the absence of the metropolis, but the presence of a cosmopolitan culture, I sense an assumption that I can't explain because they're scientists. The second thing is to reinforce that assumption of the single source. So why would there be a single source? Why would they be committed to it? Because ultimately, if you wanted to get rid of all these odious religions that keep slinging mud at you and saying, we don't need to support you with our funds, and you guys are contradicting the Bible, and we want to teach creation in schools, if you want to get rid of what most people call monotheistic religions, or religions of the book, of which, we don't regard orthodoxy as either one of those. But if you wanted to get rid of them, what you would simply posit and try to prove, the ideal refutation of most odious religions would be that simultaneous evolutionary development occurred, that you had people arising at different parts of the world at different times. And then you would solve many problems related to migration, and you wouldn't even need to say, well, yeah, but we can't do that because there's too much evidence that the DNA is shared. But wouldn't natural selection favor certain DNA choices over others? So maybe it's a stretch, but I sense an assumption that commits to the timeline and periods, commits to the single source, commits to a dismissal of human organization prior to the discovery of Jericho.
Right.
And a final assumption that seems to be there, which is, for lack of a better term, I can only call a commitment, a commitment to a commitment of permanence. So the belief is, it seems, that if these civilizations are there, we would have found them because what? They would have built them out of steel and materials that would have lasted. And yet, we discover that ancient record-keeping systems in South America were done with string and knots. They kept some of the most important religious and tax records and other things and rolls of the people by tying knots in little threads.
Right.
If ancient man had a cosmopolitan form of organization, but no psychic or psychological need to create structures that would be found later, 10 million years later, because they didn't really care about archaeology, or it wasn't one of the cultural values that was prevalent. They basically were living in a Walmart. It's sort of like, I don't need this shovel to last longer than this job, so I get $5 for it. Why is that not a possibility? Why the assumption that if they were there would be the same commitment to permanence evincing their presence that we have today in a post-archaeological sort of presentist environment? It seems like a whole lot of assumptions.
It is. And let me take a break and address that, because there are a lot of things that I think are suggestive of precisely the type of civilizational organization that you're getting at, that had to exist in order for there to be things like art, fishing, and so on and so forth. So let me take a break. I'll be right back.
You're my sunshine in the darkest days, my better half, my saving grace. You make me who I wanna be. You make it deep.
I can only take so much.
Huh?
I thought you might have
No.
fallen in.
No. Um, no, I've been drinking. I've been up all night and I've been drinking lots of tea. No, let me try and summarize.
That's going to go well in the bloopers. I'm just going to cut the part where you say,
Oh no, don't do
all night
that.
drinking. You know, that's the one I want to get in there. We start this show with I've been up all night drinking.
No, let me summarize what you're saying, because I think it's important to get this. We have evidence prior to the first known city dwelling, namely Jericho, that shows evidence of some sort of civilization, cultural, social organization. We have fishing, we have domestication of dogs, we have art, and so on and so forth. There's another very important thing that we have prior to Jericho, and this is the construction of henges, these circular structures that are dating from about 35,000 years, I think, is the oldest one that they've dated. And what's very interesting about them, and this is going back to the work of the Oxford engineering don, professor by the name of Alexander Thom, Thom. He concluded that not only were these structures very ancient, but they were for the purpose of enshrining and embedding metrology. And metrology based on, and this is a crucial point, metrology based not on the standard academic explanation of, using body parts for a measure, which gives you chaos, but based on geodetic and astronomical units of measure, which will give you uniformity across a very, very wide region. So he documented and I think successfully proved the case that the European henges all the way from Poland to France, England, and so on, had a uniform measure, which he calls I forget now what he called it, some sort of yard, which would be about 2.72 of our yard. So in other words, it was an established unit of measure that was enshrined and embodied in these structures all over Europe in the middle megalithic period. In other words, predating Jericho by about 15,000 years. Now, what does that mean? Why is that significant? Because if you are going to organize something like fishing or domestication of animals, or even to have art, and if you're going to conduct commerce on anything more than a merely local basis, you have to have units of measure in order to establish commerce over a wide region. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is add that bit of data into what you are arguing, and what you have are all the indications, all the trappings of some sort of civilization predating that magical crypto-dispensationalist year of 10,000 BC. It has to be there if you're going to have any of those activities. So again, I'm in agreement with you. I think the template that they're bringing to their organization of the timeline is really not, it's not reflective of what's actually there in the evidence. The evidence is telling us something different. The evidence is telling us that somebody is building these structures in kind of a rush all over the planet. And that tells me that they're building the structures to enshrine these units of measure, not because they are suddenly waking up, but rather they're part of an act of preservation from something that pre-existed. And they're preserving these things in the most permanent way that they can, using stone, using geological features, and so on and so forth. So to me, that bespeaks not progress, but something, an activity that is best explained by a group of people, an elite, if you will, that is trying to jumpstart civilization again, because what they were used to has collapsed. So again, I think the template is, I think you're absolutely correct. The template that they're using is all wrong.
Well, there's certainly enough enough plausible possibilities for how ancient civilizations would disappear.
Sure.
Not only the geologic ones already mentioned, which would eradicate the physical signs of the culture,
Right.
but in terms of wiping out the people, you've got ancient disease. We're
Yes.
discovering there's an ancient form of leukemia, a
Yes.
virus that brings leukemia that's affecting Australia. Ancient genocide. We just dug up one of the largest, if not the largest, child human sacrifice pit in Peru.
Mhm.
And human sacrifice on a large scale is nothing short of genocide. You've got ancient extinction of either the various species. We know that Neanderthal went extinct, and some of the other people that we now call men are extinct. But also extinction of their actual prey. There's an article we'll include in the notes that indicates that human beings hunted large mammals to extinction. That once we were rife with giant sloths, they're 7 feet tall, and giant mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and dire wolves and other behemoth beasts. But that we can show evidence that they steadily dwindled as man hunted them until you reached a point where basically the small game that we have today, relatively small by comparison, is what was left. So you've got a reduction in the food source, and you've got ancient hunting tactics that favored large animals over small, and consequently contributed to that. So there was a tactical human problem at work. So there are lots of plausible reasons that don't require aliens or an asteroid strike or even the Giza Death Star for wiping out ancient man. But I have another question, a series of questions, and I'll try to bundle them to keep them short. But I have some questions that have troubled me. You see pyramids in every culture. I mean, it's becoming increasingly clear that if we didn't catch on a few years ago, we should be catching on now. They just dug up some people in South America that they're like, wow, there's an entire people underneath this pyramid. And it isn't a pretty pyramid. Maybe it was worn down by the elements, or maybe they just couldn't build as nice a pyramid as the Egyptians or whatever, but it's still a pyramid. And, not everybody, I'm sure the prom dresses in Rio Lindo, California are not as nice as, the ones in Boston or something. But so I look at that and I can't help but wonder if ancient humans might have been working from a single universal map. And I know this may seem like a side trail.
No, it isn't.
But here's what I'm thinking. I'm going down this path to bring in another topic that you're also blogging about, which is related, potentially related. So when you see people all over the world creating similar structures, you have to decide that either A, they all have access to the same piece of information, and that piece of information is so prevalent and visible or accessible that it's the main thing on their minds, or one of the main things. It'd be like if a giant, something giant was in orbit and the whole planet saw it all the time. Another, the sun suddenly turned blue. We would all know that, except for some very remote spots in Antarctica. The other would be some universal system of communication or whatever. But the simplest, to me, the simplest straight line would be, well, you would all build pyramids if you had a map of something else that you were trying to imitate. And that map could be off-world, because also people have posited that there are similar structures off-world. Or it could be a map of some place that had evangelists that were sort of, proto-Christian evangelists that were bringing it around, or indeed there could be a form of communicating three-dimensional objects in an ancient civilization. So I'm going to go somewhere with this in a second, but before I expose that, I want to ask you, why is science not making a bigger deal right now out of the fact that everywhere they keep doing it? They keep saying, oh, we found another pyramid. Oh, we found another pyramid. Oh, there's one in Slovenia. Oh, there's one over here. And why are they not making a bigger deal of, that seems rather odd if you're going to say that they had art, music, deep sea fishing, domestication of animals, but there's no way they could have communicated and shared any of this because they didn't live in Jericho. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes a lot of listen. I'm totally on board with you, because I think partly, Daniel, that there is a reluctance of science to make a comprehensive model of all of these individual discoveries, precisely because I think at some intuitive level they sense that in order for them to do that, it's going to overturn the template by which they've been operating and dating things. I am absolutely convinced, I wrote a whole book called Grid of the Gods. I am absolutely convinced that, number one, the location of these structures all over the world does indicate that they're following some universal model. And the disturbing thing about it is this is discoverable if you use Giza as the primary meridian on planet Earth. So in other words, not Greenwich, but Giza. If you do that, what pops out is you get very interesting placements of things 120 degrees east latitude of Giza. Think of Angkor Wat, and you get interesting placements 120 degrees west latitude of Giza. Think of Teotihuacan and certain places in Mesoamerica. So in other words, there is some sort of very identifiable structure or grid that indicates that they're operating with a universal template of some sort. And they're in a hurry to do this. They're building these things all over the world, particularly in the megalithic period. One of the most interesting things, I want to mention this while I'm thinking about it, if people do not, if the members are not aware of this individual, there was a fellow by the name of Carl Monk years ago, and I want to pull out a book that he self-published. And this guy was a pilot and basically did a massive amount of work on that system. And it's called the Master Code Book. And it's simply about the placement of all of these megalithic structures around the world and how they fit on a very carefully well thought out grid system. And to me, I think he makes his case, and he makes it almost overwhelmingly. It's hard to ignore. Let's look at something else. Not only do we find pyramids on planet Earth, but after the Viking mission took those famous pictures on Mars, Carl Sagan published a book, and in typical Sagan fashion, he wouldn't come out and say anything directly about what was photographed, but he did say Mars has surprises. And I think one of the things that he was referring to is there's a picture that Viking took of Mars where there are very clearly little pyramidal structures on Mars. And there's another famous extraterrestrial off-world set of structure called the Blair Cuspids on the moon, which look for all the world like obelisks. And this was photographed by an early Soviet probe, Luna 2 or Luna 3, one of the two, I think. But these things are out there. So in other words, we're confronted with a big, huge problem. And again, it doesn't fit our quasi-dispensationalist template. And the big problem here again is metrology. Why are these things placed with regularity that regular placement itself would indicate that they have geodetic and astronomical systems of measure? And you have to have those things in order for there to be commerce. Commerce is based on systems of measure, media of exchange, volume, mass, weight, length, and so on. Everything that we buy, we are dependent on a system of measure that is more or less universal. So again, I think everything argues to the existence of something civilizational in structure. The reason we don't find evidence for these things is that we're expecting to find remains of industrial civilization. Again, going back to that Scientific American article, my biggest problem with it was the assumption that this civilization is the template by which any previous advanced civilization must be measured. Well, poppycock. I think that they were working with a much profounder physics, and that means that they had a very different understanding of energy. They had a very different understanding of structure. They had a very different understanding of the planet. One of the things that's very clear is that many of these structures are located on, if you were to create a system of interfering waves on the surface of the planet, they're at intersections of these waves. So in other words, that placement is not accidental. There's a physics understanding that they're tapping into.
Well, so now I'm going to hit you with a series of questions. You probably want your Post-it note, because I'm going to try to get them at you and see which ones you want to take on. This is not the end of the show where we often do this, but it's the heart of the show. I moved it up. So you're also blogging about another recent article about quantum entanglement working at a macro level.
Yes.
Okay. And so that question I asked was on purpose, out of curiosity, but also because it leads into this. Wow, there's a storm coming. Oh, sky's turning black. That's just before the asteroid hits. That's the last thing. And then the line goes dark. You know? But also either that or you see two men in white coats behind me. And you know,
no, I don't want you to be flattened by an asteroid. It's just
I come back and I'm like, yes, Dr. Farrell, I'm here. My head is jutting out from the implant. But so we're talking about quantum entanglement or spooky action at a distance, at a macro level. And here's what I don't understand about the exploration so far. Okay, so I'm going to ask the bold question and then ask you why I ask it. So the bold question is, could quantum entanglement be a factor in dictating culture?
Yes.
Not a merely physical phenomenon. So for example, the suggestion that, wow, now the winds are blowing through. I need a minute. I'm going to close all the windows in the house.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll be right back.
He's closing the windows to prevent the asteroid strike, folks. It's not going to do any good.
An asteroid strike?
Never mind. Never mind. Windows ain't going to do it if it's an asteroid.
Well, Dr. Farrell, I learned what to do when I was in grade school. What you do is you huddle under your desk and put your head between your legs,
Yes.
which, though it won't protect you, it's a pleasurable sensation.
Jeez. Golly. Jeez. I remember those drills too.
Yeah,
and I got into an argument with my second grade teacher. You know, if the Russians are going to A-bomb Sioux Falls, South Dakota, hiding under this desk ain't going to do a whole lot of good, you know.
Yeah, I got in real trouble. I got marched out of class during the nuclear bomb drill where everyone else got to hide. I had to stand up in the vulnerable position because we had just watched the video. And my question was, teacher, did you see how all those buildings got completely demolished and everything, all the windows blew out, everything went through and the trees bent over? So why is hiding under my desk going to protect me? That's not what I saw in the video. It doesn't make sense. Even the cows got taken away, you know.
Yep.
And they're like, they're basically like, you can't ask that question. I'm like, no, it's
well, why not?
Yeah, well, I thought you told me, remember at the beginning of the year I could ask any question.
But not that one.
Not that one. Dr. Farrell, I'm concerned by the sheer size and girth of your iced tea.
Yes, well, I only have to refill it once. That lasts me the whole day. So, you know, I don't have to go constantly to fill up my glass of tea.
I think we should name it Gertha. You have the bat, Bertha. Now we have your iced tea jar. We'll give it the name Gertha. Just paint eyes on it and put a couple of bat wings. Put it right in the aquarium. You heard it, ladies and gentlemen. He needs a custom bat cup.
Oh, please. No, I don't.
At least as big as Gertha. All right. Well, so my question about entanglement is I don't see them exploring the potential effects on culture, only on physical phenomenon. And so the questions I have are, number one, why exempt humans and only focus on other physical objects? Why limit this to physical properties? If quantum entanglement exists and you can get spooky action at a distance, why couldn't you have an explanation for why cultures would arise doing the same thing at the same time, or even DNA would be selected at roughly the same time if you had multiple evolutionary development streams? Why couldn't quantum entanglement account for that? Number two is, could quantum entanglement, in fact, lead us down the path of a new science of astrology? Because after all, we're talking about the effect of events in time and space on other time and space.
Right.
That's all astrology is. And number three, couldn't quantum entanglement even affect the development of life elsewhere in the universe and the rise or fall of civilizations? And then, if that were true, is there a distance limit? It doesn't seem like there would be, because it's quantum. And by definition, if there's no distance limit, couldn't therefore the rise and development of other civilizations in the universe affect the rise and development of ours?
Right.
And so what we're really potentially looking at when we look at the timeline is a timeline that mirrors a timeline happening elsewhere in the universe. And a couple more questions. So number four is, could the fall, therefore, of human civilizations be a result, their demise and elimination, be the result of forces outside the known universe? They didn't die from pollution or war. They died because the corresponding civilization in another place died, or the climate changed. We now think that Jupiter may be contributing to climate change here.
Yes.
The climate change or other factors occurred elsewhere in the universe, and there were corresponding occurrences here. And finally, we kind of skipped over that part at the beginning of the show where I quoted that same article about thermal signatures and said that the guy had posited that if there were ancient civilizations, we might find off-world evidence of those civilizations. Does it not make us wonder that if we accept that there is this possibility of quantum entanglement at a cosmic level, would that not amp up potentially our need to go out there and find the sources that affect our world, leading us on a manhunt, if you will, for other civilizations?
Yes, absolutely.
So I threw all that on you to have fun with.
Yeah, well, I'm going to, because you're touching on a lot of topics that I've been heavily researching lately and that I will be addressing in some detail. Hopefully sometime this year. My assumption, and the implicit assumption of your question, has always been that entanglement is not merely a quantum phenomenon, that it does exist at a macro level. And my suspicion is that the higher you go in terms of the scale of the physical system, the more that entanglement is going to manifest itself as feedback loops between different systems. In other words, this is a very open system physics, which, I've been hammering on ever since I started this weird line of books. So if that's the assumption, would this have an effect on culture, or could it have an effect on culture? And the answer is yes. So you cannot exempt humans from this study. Now, that is the way you put it. And I think that is hugely critical and hugely important. That's a crucial observation, because if you go back and look at some of the things that Plato writes about in some of his dialogues, Timaeus, the Republic, the Cratylus, and so on and so forth. One thing that, if you look at it with these types of eyes on, this is precisely what he's talking about. He's talking about a if I can put it this way, he's talking about a field of information with his idea of the Platonic ideas, the universals. He's talking about what a physicist would call a field of information, and what to stretch the term, what a parapsychologist would call a field of intention, of intentionality, of conscious intentionality. And it was part and parcel of their thinking, particularly in Plato's understanding of anamnesis, the idea of remembering that you come from a higher world. All right. If you plug all that into the idea of entanglement, what you see from Plato up until the Baroque era is you have a cosmology that is based on this interplay, this entanglement of systems. And part and parcel of this idea is you can influence that macro system by human intentionality. And again, I want to, if people that are listening to this have not listened to that members webinar on the work of Dr. William Tiller, professor of materials science at the University of Southern California, he has performed experiments where he has documented absolutely the ability of conscious intention to make modification in specific material, both organic and inorganic, in specifically specified ways, shortening the gestation period of fruit flies, raising and lowering the pH levels in inorganic solutions, and so on and so forth. This, to me, this is stunning, but what it's documenting is a kind of entanglement at a macro level. So expand that. Could that then be extended to culture? And I have to say the answer is probably yes. Could this in turn be a physics basis for astrology? And again, I have to say yes. And here it gets very interesting, because if you go back and read what the Babylonians say about astrology, or what the Egyptians say about astrology, there's two things that they make a point of that make their astrology very different from the little books that we find in the grocery store aisle. Number one, they state very clearly and explicitly that this was a science that they learned after thousands of years of observation. Now, that in itself is a stunning statement, because again, it goes against this quasi-dispensationalist template that I think you're correct in viewing that these scientists are operating from, because it assumes that when you get to Sumer, which springs up out of nowhere and has a fully fledged archaeology, what they're telling you is that these observations are taken over thousands of years that predate our own civilization. Well, who's doing the observing? And it's also telling you that as far as they were concerned, it was an empirical science, which brings me to the second point. If you look at the astrology that they're doing, they are casting what a modern astrologer would call a mundane horoscope. And a mundane horoscope was a horoscope for the king. In other words, it was a horoscope not for an individual, it was a horoscope for a city-state or a society. So in other words, they're telling you, I think, with that alone, that they are basing their astrological prediction on statistics. So let's leap forward into the early Middle Ages and all of those debates about predestination and free will, when the medieval philosophers, the church fathers, and so on and so forth, were talking about that question in connection with astrology. What do they say? Well, they come to reject astrology because they think it means that it is an absolute determination on the individual. And interestingly enough, there's a mathematical correlation here as to in my opinion, as to why they're thinking this. Because the mathematics that they had available to them from, say, Plato up to the early Enlightenment was not a mathematics that could handle probabilities. It was not a mathematics that could handle statistics. It was either this or that, and that was it. Once you get statistics, the debate changes, because now you can have a statistical correlation of a vast population, but none of that population, just like the particles in physics, are able to be determined on an individual basis. All that the math can tell you is that this is the probable result of a wide number of people, but the individuals in the sample are not predestined, and therefore still preserve their free will, and so on and so forth. So there's a mathematical component to these arguments, I think, that has gone unnoticed for a very, very long time. You get hints of it in Plato, but again, they don't have the mathematical tools, at least as far as we know, that would have allowed them to make these kinds of statistical predictions. That said, I want to remind everybody of what Descartes and Newton and Leibniz all said when they were looking at ancient mathematical texts. They all concluded that there was some form of analysis that the ancients possessed that was either deliberately suppressed or forgotten. And all three men kind of leaned towards the deliberate suppression. I'm thinking that part of that suppressed mathematical technique may have been some sort of statistical analysis that really doesn't get restored until Newton and Leibniz invent the calculus, and then you get the calculus of probabilities and variations and so on.
Promise software only.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So then you had the question, could this kind of thinking affect life off planet in other systems? And if we assume, again, the hypothesis that entanglement is a phenomenon that is much larger than just the quantum scale, if in fact there's a kind of consciousness entanglement, which I think there definitely is, the whole analogical calculus topological metaphor of the medium idea is predicated on that assumption. If you look at it that way, I think you'd again have to say yes. And there's a little bit of evidence for this in modern scientific thinking. You've got, on the one hand, you've got a certain group of physicists that have been toying now for some years, for a few decades, with the idea of what they're calling the anthropic cosmological principle, which is really wild once you start reading about it. But in essence, what they're saying is that mankind, in terms of scale and gauge mathematical analysis, stands not only at the exact mean or midpoint of scales of physical systems from the very small to galactic superclusters, but also that it appears that if you were to adjust any of the constants of physics just the slightest degree, you would lose the ability to create life. So the thinking is that the way that the system is actually engineered is to create a conscious observer, an intelligent observer. So there's your entanglement, because if that's built in as a cosmological principle, it stands to reason that it's going to appear here, it might appear elsewhere in the universe, and so on. There's a second clue to this idea, and believe it or not, it comes from the Majestic 12 documents about UFOs, and in specific context, it comes from that collection of Majestic 12 documents called the Cooper-Cantwell documents. This is the second set of documents, not the first set. And it's that second set of documents which is the overwhelming bulk of that Majestic 12 material. I reviewed one of those documents in SS Brotherhood of the Bell because it says something truly astonishing. And again, the document itself, it doesn't matter for our purpose here, whether the document is genuine or if it's fake or if it's disinformation, in other words, containing some genuine stuff with a lot of fake stuff, because the statement is so profound that I think that at least whoever, if these documents are fake or if they're disinformation, whoever did it was very, very well informed. And the statement is that to the effect that when these Majestic 12 scientists that were part of this UFO brain trust allegedly examined the bodies that were recovered at Roswell and other crash sites. And again, I'm not in the Roswell ET camp. But when they examined these bodies, they came to the conclusion that the hominid humanoid form may be a part of a higher order of unification between the biological and physical sciences. In other words, what these guys are talking about is a grand unified theory that theoretical physics has been seeking, but in terms of the actual emergence of life itself as a consequence of this cosmology of entanglement. So, that's a huge statement to make in a document like that. In any document, it's a huge statement to make. So I think, again, if we entertain the idea of macro entanglement, then technically there can't be any limit to the scale at which it is applied. And therefore, entanglement would affect the origin of life and the shape of life, not only here, but elsewhere. In other words, what we're saying is wherever we go, life is going to look awfully similar, regardless of the evolutionary course it took, because there is a higher order symmetry and entanglement taking place. So, on to question 4. Could that mean then that the fall is something that is the result of something taking place at a higher, let's say at a higher, to use the physics term, at a higher gauge, at a higher scale? And the answer again is yes. Would that result in ripple effects throughout all of these entangled systems? And again, the result is yes. You do have that view in some of the church fathers, this idea that the fall is a cosmic event, that it's not simply something that affected man, but it affected everything. You get that in Irenaeus, Maximus, Damascus, Thomas Aquinas. So, that thinking has been around for a long time. What we're just doing is saying that there might be a cosmological physics basis for it. So, final question that you had was, could that in turn be if I'm understanding your last question correctly, could that be a possible state or motivation for us searching for other life? I suspect so, and I'll up the ante before I take another break. I suspect it's also behind what I've been calling, and we've talked about this in vid chats, what I've been calling data correlation experiments. Because if you suspect that consciousness has an entanglement effect on systems beyond the quantum scale, at the scales of actual physical objects in everyday life, like Dr. Tiller has demonstrated, if you suspect that, then you are going to want to run group observer experiments of data correlation. And the way you would do that is change data in the timeline. And I'm talking about the Mandela effect here. And what would result from that would be an increasingly, if I can put it this way, porous world. So with that, I'm going to take a break and let you simmer in those juices.
I'm simmering. Juicy. juices. If you listen closely, you can hear them simmer. It's not very loud. I can find a louder one. It's kind of gross.
My ears are burning.
Those are simmering juices.
Okay, yes, okay, yeah, got
They're
it.
kind of gross.
Yes, got it. No, I've been drinking lots of water too. I try and drink 10 glasses, at least 10 glasses of water a day, in addition to my tea. So
It balances out the tea nicely.
well, tea like coffee it's a diuretic. You know, it eliminates liquids from your body. So I drink extra water because of that.
Daddy, how do the liquids come out of your...
Oh, never mind, Daniel.
I'm
Jeez.
surprised you're willing to talk about bodily fluids at all. Usually you really steer away from that. So
No, it's bodily fluids. Come on, this is Stanley Kubrick, Dr. Strangelove. You know, I'm in this to restore the purity of our essence and our bodily fluids. But I'd have no intention of launching a thermonuclear attack on Russia. But
I drink only rose water.
yeah, right. Uh-huh. Yes. Thank you, General Jack D. Ripper.
That's very harsh. Well, yeah, all right. So I just wanted to clarify that my question wasn't about the fall of man, though that was interesting because I hadn't made that connection that would be an example of quantum entanglement. But I was basically asking if the fall of a civilization here
Sure.
could create the fall of a civilization either in another part of the world or off world. I don't mean literally and directly, but I mean if you have quantum entanglement, it suggests the reproduction of at any level, at a macro level, it suggests the reproduction of similar
Right.
forces of causation at another location.
Right.
So you could have civilizations rising, prompting other civilizations to rise, civilizations falling, prompting other
Right.
civilizations to fall. That's sort of what I was asking. But I hadn't made the association with the fall of man. But to pursue this down a slightly different path, as promised, picking up where the astrology part left off.
Okay.
You and I were once asked in a diner. Somebody said, I think you were there, but they said, "Do you think that the occult is real? That when some people conjure up demons or cast spells, that something actually happens?" And I said, it wouldn't matter because the fact that a thing is real doesn't make it either wise or good or useful or the thing that you think it is.
Right.
The noise in your head might be real, but that doesn't tell you where it's coming from.
Right.
So for some people, that's all they need to sort of become devotees of something. Is it real? And I think that's a block-headed way to proceed. But could it? The question I have is, couldn't this pursuit of the idea that quantum entanglement at a macro level exists not produce essentially an objective form of the occult? And I think of that as I sent you the article about talismanic publishing, which sort of suggests that it's a name for publishing a book at a specific date on an occult calendar with specific paper, with specific ink, specific fonts, specific materials, all that correspond to certain occult concepts, dates, times, numbers, etc., to create so that the act of publishing itself becomes the talisman or becomes the occult act. And so there are people that sit around and work on this stuff, but it strikes me that if quantum entanglement were a fact at a macro level, then you could potentially create an effect on people and things by doing another action like publishing, for instance.
Right. No, when I read that article and you're absolutely correct in that what you're doing, what it sounds like they're doing with this talismanic publishing, is they're creating a psychometric object. In other words, they have a specific formal intention that they are embedding in the object by lots of little detailed techniques to create, here comes the word, folks, to create an affect in the recipient of the book. All right. So in other words, what we're dealing with here is the old doctrine of affect. And, you know, this was the doctrine by which artists, sculptors, architects, composers operated from Plato all the way up to the Baroque. And it's the idea that you are not attempting to create or to imprison, so to speak, your subjective emotions in whatever artistic creation you're creating, to communicate those emotions at some sort of subliminal level directly to another person. That aesthetic, that philosophy really begins more or less with the classical period, and then it really gets the kick in the Romantic era. That's the Romantic aesthetic. That's the aesthetic that moderns tend to think of when they think of art. But prior to that, the idea was very, very different. There were a number of formula that were used very consciously, very deliberately, and in very detailed little ways. You know, I wish I had the ability to go do a webinar and use a music score and go through a piece of music and show all of these little devices that are in these Baroque era compositions to create an affect. And the affect, this goes all the way back to Plato again. The affect is a universal human passion. In other words, it's something embedded in human nature. Think of Carl Gustav Jung and, you know, his collective archetypes and the collective unconscious and so on and so forth. Well, these are universal passions embedded in human nature, which can be summoned or evoked or conjured, if you want to use the talismanic publishing word for it, by the careful application of certain procedures and formula that evoke these things. And the biggest example I can give of that cosmological philosophy is movie music. If you were to watch a movie, say the Star Wars trilogy or Eyes Wide Shut or 2001 Space Odyssey, if you were to watch those movies without the musical soundtrack, your effective response to those movies would be very different. So in other words, the music itself is conjuring affects by itself. And when it's coupled to a visual artistic medium like a film, then its power is even more potent. But the affect is actually being conjured by the music. You're reacting a certain way. And film score composers are probably the only musicians left after the Baroque era that know these formulae and how to use them to conjure these affects and therefore a subjective response. So in other words, you're dealing in this cosmology, you're dealing with subjective emotions at a remove, so to speak, where you're really dealing with a universal, and it's going to create subjective responses, but the subjective responses are going to be more or less similar. It's a very, very different cosmological and philosophical aesthetic. But I do think that what this means is that, again, with this idea of entanglement, with what Dr. Tiller has done in his work, what it indicates is precisely what you're getting at. We are approaching the point, we're at the beginning of figuring out a scientific approach to the interrelationship of cosmology and of entanglement of consciousness and subjective response to all of these things. We're at the very beginning of it. We we unfortunately abandoned a lot of the clues to this cosmology with the stylistic turn in the 18th century. But, you know, it was more or less a universal cosmological aesthetic from Plato on up, and probably predating Plato, actually. I think we're recovering some of that, and I think in order to recover it, we're going to have to pay increasing attention to the visual arts, to music, to architecture, absolutely, and how that is injecting information into the field that we subliminally pick up on. It's a very subtle and soft form of mind manipulation when you get right down to it. And because it's mind manipulation, since we're talking about physics, what you're doing is you're manipulating the template by which the observer measures things. Let's remember what quantum mechanics is. Right at the heart of quantum mechanics is the uncertainty principle. You cannot measure the position and the momentum of an electron at the same time. So you predetermine what it is you're going to observe prior to the performance of the experiment. Now, blow that up to the macro level. If you're creating a template of a kind of unconsciously understood template of response to data, just like your scientists at the beginning that you mentioned with their kind of crypto dispensationalism, if you're creating a template of response to things, you can manipulate so the thinking would go. You can manipulate reality in the macro. This is very, very dangerous stuff.
Well, so in the narrative about that, I want to gently drop this piece from the news in, because I don't know that it's significant, but it certainly struck me at the time that I was looking at everything else in the news, that this came up. So this is about ancient cuneiform tablets, about 3,500 or 3,450 pieces of them that were purchased illegally by Hobby Lobby.
Yes.
And Steve Green and the Green family, the owner of Hobby Lobby, ostensibly for their Museum of the Bible. And they were looted treasures from Iraq.
Right.
And that's all according to an article in the Atlantic.
I blogged about that story.
Yeah, yeah. So the core quotation from the article in the Atlantic, I'll read that now. Technically, the defendants in the civil forfeiture action are the objects themselves, yielding an incredible case name: the United States of America versus approximately 450 ancient cuneiform tablets and approximately 3,000 ancient clay bullae. So it's a fun case, right? Hobby Lobby wired $1.6 million to 7 different bank accounts associated with 5 different people to pay for the items. The artifacts were shipped to the United States in multiple packages, falsely labeled tiles, sample. They were also sent to multiple locations. As the complaint notes, quote, the use of multiple shipping addresses for a single recipient is consistent with methods used by cultural property smugglers to avoid scrutiny by customs. On customs forms, the UAE, United Arab Emirates dealer supplied false invoices that substantially undervalued the pieces, presumably as a way to avoid customs inspection. And then there's another quote: for its part, the Green family has framed this as a lesson learned. In 2010, Hobby Lobby was, quote, new to the world of acquiring these items and did not fully appreciate the complexities of the acquisition process, unquote. Read a statement from the company's website. Quote, this resulted in some regrettable mistakes. The company imprudently relied on dealers and shippers who, in hindsight, did not understand the correct way to document and ship these items, unquote, which is to write corn on the box, of course.
Yes, exactly.
And ship them one at a time, you know. No, regardless of how one feels about that statement and how believable that is, clearly the government does not agree, and these pieces are going back to Iraq, where they will go into the bowels of the Iraq Museum establishment. Now, Hobby Lobby is run by the Green family, who are avid members of the Assembly of God, which is a premillennial dispensationalist organization.
Right.
And which again is not to paint all dispensationalists with the same brush, or all Assemblies of God with one brush, or anything like that, or even to cast aspersions other than maybe what the article did on the Green family, because come on, it looks pretty obvious that there was a little bit more than we just didn't know how to ship it correctly, you know. But yeah, that's right. But and Ollie North just really didn't understand that he was supposed to FedEx that stuff with a full customs disclosure. It wasn't. He misread the UPS instructions, you know. But I can't help but notice one line in the there was a couple of articles I read about it, but one line in the article, and I don't remember if this was the Vox article or the other one I read, which I think was CNN, but it said that most of the tablets contained essentially like tax information and things like that, but a number of them contained magic spells.
Right.
And, I found that interesting because
I did too.
I find it interesting that members of the Assembly of God would want to own a bunch of magic spells, let alone ancient ones inscribed in ancient, inscribed in these ancient artifacts, but two, put them on display in the Museum of the Bible. Maybe, I suppose, assuming an innocent motive on that part of the transaction, at least, one could say, oh, they wanted to demonstrate that actually existed. And that, therefore the Bible's true in that regard. Abraham came out of Ur, but no one disputes that anymore. So it's not really helpful. I keep coming back to these magic spells. And as I think about quantum entanglement, and I think about the history of archaeology thus far and how we tend to utilize perhaps what could be called a quasi-religious template for analyzing it, I can't help but wonder if there's something else going on here, that this is about the act. What if for a second we just suppose that this is not what the Green family says it is, and it's not even what Vox thinks it is, but it were some other alternative, like the acquisition, the purposeful, intentional acquisition of ancient magic spells from ancient Sumer. What if it were that? One would have to believe that that there could be a quantum entanglement-like effect, that one says a magic spell and a thing happens somewhere, almost like a belief in talismanic publishing. One would have to share some ideas with these occultists that are, or these occult aficionados that are talking about talismanic publishing. And perhaps in that regard, when the Bible refers to magic spells and things like that, to some people that could signal that's bad. But if and don't delve into that. But for people that are actively buying up said magic spells, it might signal that, hey, magic spells are a real thing. You probably want to acquire some of those because they work. So my question, which I'm kind of feeling around in the dark for here, is, does this smell weird to you that a dispensationalist heavily, and I mean, this is Hobby Lobby is a group that actively and publicly announces that it tries to convert employees, brags about the number of conversions, makes it a thing, and really is, they're not just a Chick-fil-A. They are a Christian business in every conceivable sense of, if you took that form of Christianity and executed that in the form of a business. They are trying to do that, with the exception, of course, of thou shalt not steal or lie or any of those things. But assuming that one is willing to lie or steal to obtain magic spells, does that not raise at least the ostensible suspicion that there's a link between dispensational thinking, the occult in this case, and that the possibility that if one is willing to do something by surreptitious means to obtain magic, that one might actually believe in that magic? Or am I just blowing?
No. I don't. I think you're stating almost exactly what I was thinking when I wrote that blog, because I pointed out that statement too, that there were a few of these cuneiform tablets that had magic spells, incantations, and so on and so forth on them. And what struck me, and what I argued in the blog, and I'm going to extend my remarks considerably here and put it in the context of that conversation that you alluded to. I think it was in that coffee house in Tulsa on Peoria that conversation took place years and years ago. But what caught my eye was not only that statement about the magic spells and so on, but also the statement that they were going to be taken back to Iraq and put in the Baghdad Museum, where, you know, for all intents and purposes, they're going to disappear. And in the article that I read, there were scholars that were upset that, you know, these tablets were going to be returned before any of them had a chance to, you know, copy them and start translating them. And, you know, the surest way to keep them out of the public eye is to take them back to the Baghdad Museum, where, you know, ever since the Iraq War, Iraq's ability, you know, their scholars have basically fled the country. So the people that could have translated those things that used to be in Iraq are no longer there. So that's a good way to remove any information that you don't want getting out, is ship it back to Iraq. I suspect, and I advanced this speculation in the blog, that given the time that Hobby Lobby had possession of them, it would have been a simple matter to photograph the tablets and have scholars working on translations of those tablets privately, you know, for hire. We'll pay you so many thousands of dollars to translate these things from the photographs. And you could do it that way. And at that point, that information becomes proprietary. So I suspect, to extend your speculation, that Hobby Lobby knew good and well what they were doing. You know, this business that, well, we didn't really understand the shipping. We didn't realize this was stolen, blah, blah, blah. I think this was really an effort to get a hold of certain tablets, to photograph them for the purposes of translation. And, you know, yeah, we'll go along, you know, we'll pay the fine and ship them back, because we've got the information that they contained. And that was really what the exercise was all about, getting the information, not the tablets themselves, but what was on the tablets. So that brings me to the next question. You mentioned that it isn't necessary for people to think that the occult is real or not. And I agree, because what's the important point here is that you do have certain people in the world, a lot of people in the world, that do believe it's real, and they act and take decisions accordingly. And thus, their belief structure also becomes a template. It will affect the field of information. And that's really, if you get right down to it, when you get heavily into study of occult practices, that's really what it's all about. It's, again, that mind-matter relationship and the subtle influences of the former on the latter. And that is documentable. That does work. Here's what I think may be also going on in a wider cultural sense. And I'm going to have to do a little theological philosophy here. If you look at the teachings of the Christian church, it's sacramental. And again, if you look at it in a general way, what you have is precisely a doctrine where an intellectual or spiritual intention is coupled by certain formula to a physical object and action. All right. So again, broadly speaking, that's the same thing that the occult is saying. But what happens in the Western church is that understanding of the world gets narrowed down to the so-called 7 sacraments, the 2 dominical sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist, the Mass, and then the 5 other sacraments: confirmation, marriage, confession, extreme unction, and ordination. So in other words, the actual channels of grace become narrowed down to 7 things. Then Roman Catholic theology elaborated and said, well, there are sacramentals, there are other acts that are not, so to speak, guaranteed to convey divine grace, but nonetheless sometimes act in a sacramental way. All right. And that, you know, that's everything from icons to lighting candles to praying for somebody, so on and so forth. Those are all sacramentals. What you get in evangelicalism is very odd because it's almost the exact mirror image of that Roman Catholic distinction, because within evangelicalism you have a rejection of the sacraments. They're loath to do them, as the central feature of their worship. But on the other hand, they place an extreme emphasis on the sacramentals, the name it and claim it doctrine, prayer, works, got to stake out your claim in the Word and Jesus and all of that stuff. So in other words, they reject the sacraments, but they have lots of sacramentals. And within Roman Catholicism, you've got the sacraments and the other stuff. Well, it may work sometimes, it may not. They're mirror images of each other. And I suspect to a certain extent then that your intuition about why is it that you see so much quasi-occult practice in evangelical circles, that there's something to it. And it's coming out of this whole cultural matrix of, Reformation reaction to Catholicism, to Roman Catholicism, and, the counter-Reformation reaction to the reaction. So it's part of our culture. It's another one of those subliminal templates that people seem to be operating with, just like your scientists with their quasi-dispensationalist timeline, of 3 ages, primitivism and beginning civilization, and then finally we arrive at, civilization. So yeah, I think there's something subliminal here going on, and Hobby Lobby, just like a lot of others, are tapping into that, and they probably don't even know it.
Well, we'll include some links in the show notes about the evolving launch of the Museum of the Bible, because that in and of itself is a story. The forgeries, the destruction of artifacts in mummy mask dissolved in Palmolive to see if there were hidden messages, and now it's gone forever, by a guy with no experience, and firing various scholars and just a whole host of things going on around this Disneyland of the book. And as from my point of view, even having a Museum of the Bible suggests, obviously, that the Bible is primarily a work of archaeology and not primarily a living document of a community that wrote it and is using it to worship the Creator of whom it speaks. But so and only in that community can it properly be understood.
Yeah, it's like having a museum of the Quran. If you want to translate it, go to Mecca and say you're going to open up a museum of the Quran, and how would a pious Muslim react to that? It's the same mentality.
Like dropping it on a group of Martians, and they're like, okay, I guess I'll figure it out from the book. And it's no different than if you dropped a mitre or a pew. Here's a pew, figure it out. And it would logically get you there. The belief in the text itself as being almost talismanic is itself a corollary to many dispensationalist religions, and not one shared by those Christian confessions that reject dispensation.
Well, it's certainly not shared by Roman Catholicism, and it's certainly Anglicanism or Orthodoxy or even Lutheranism to a certain extent. Luther's different.
Anglicanism of the rainbow vestments and
not that Anglicanism. No. Not that. No.
Having the birthday for Jesus.
No, I'm talking about. When I say Anglicans, folks, I'm thinking of my old Bishop Snagglepuss.
Snagglepuss. Exit stage left.
Well, he talked that way. He did. He talked like this all the time. But no, I understand what you're saying, and again, this a lot of this is coming out of the collapse, I think, in the post-Reformation era of sacramentality. It's astonishing. You can listen to Bach's settings of the Mass for the Lutheran Church, and you're thinking, my word, what were they doing back then? Well, they were doing something very different than the modern Lutheran churches usually do. But yeah, it's all part of this doctrine of affect.
Divisive to do that now.
Well, yeah, it's divisive to do that now, and that colors your approach to the text, because it's not something that you're reading for merely intellectual content. It's actually a part of a ritual act of worship, which is very different. And if you take that out, you get this idea that, yeah, it's a talismanic text. You even get the practice in some of these churches, which is a very occult practice. I mean, it's straight out of the occult. Just flip the book, flip open the Bible, and and that's your message for the day.
Yes, exactly like the Secretary of the Interior chose his major in geology as an undergraduate. He threw a dart at a.
Yeah, he threw a dart. And it's nutty stuff like this. But again, what it's telling me is there is a psychometric template, I think, that humans operate with, and we can either operate with it rationally and try and understand it, like Dr. Tiller is trying to understand it, or we can throw darts or flip pages in the book and plop our finger down, and there it is. That's our message for the day, which is an irrational way to approach it. But it's irrational because what's missing in those approaches, what's missing in this Hobby Lobby approach, is this idea of a formally specified intention. And you're not going to get that just by opening a book and plopping your finger down. This is what frustrates me. I've been hammering this doctrine of affect with the members, because it's a very, very different worldview. And I think it's one we need to recover, because the subjectivist worldview that we've been operating under, particularly in the arts, since the 19th century has led to chaos. It's led to Schoenberg, and that's just ugliness.
Or even Schoenberg had something. It was the Schoenbergists that we.
Well, yeah, precisely. There are pieces by Schoenberg that there are atonal and serialist pieces of music that are hauntingly beautiful.
Right.
They're few and far between, but they are. But his imitators is just awful, because again, you're just imitating something. You're not putting any specific intention of your own and trying to make that intention part of a wider universal process. So this is something
Augustine that'll get you. It's the Augustinians.
Well, even there, he's certainly operating to a great degree within that whole Plato to the Baroque era. He's operating in the same cosmology. He's messing it up a lot of times, but he's at least thinking in those terms. I think, the more I look at it, the more I think that the big turn in Western civilization wasn't the Renaissance, it wasn't the Middle Ages, it wasn't the classical era. I think it was in the 18th century when that whole cosmology was basically jettisoned. And yet, I think part of that jettisoning, which is what we're seeing now, part of that jettisoning meant that only certain people kept that tradition alive, and everybody else is just kind of fumbling around like Hobby Lobby. Let's go buy some cuneiform tablets and translate them secretly and see what we come up with.
That's right. There's no way, given the descriptions of how they bought them, which
I agree with you.
In like fold-up boxes, there's no way to take phone photos on their iPhone. They got them.
Oh, so, yeah, exactly.
It's not willing to release that. Rather.
Exactly. This is my suspicion as well. There's no way, in my opinion, that this was done by accident, as they're saying. This was deliberate theft, and it kind of confirms my suspicion that part of the reason that we went in there was not simply to recover, to prevent weapons of mass destruction, but to recover possible information about ancient weapons of mass destruction. Because some of those tablets that we do know about describe, to my mind, are describing technologies that are way beyond anything that we have in terms of military technology or things like that. So I think they went in there looking for something, and so much better if we can do it under the guise of, religion and some sort of quote unquote Christian recovery of these things, and keeping it secret, in the name of Jesus.
I'll allow the possibility that they were just trying to prove the Bible true in their view of the Bible. I mean, my point,
sure.
In the same way that if you catch me outside with an entire field of marijuana, I'm going to say I'm not a very good farmer, and I planted rye bread, but this is what sprouted.
This is what sprouted. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, don't blame me for sucking at this, So, I mean, I would make the same argument when I was caught, but I just can't help but my core observation is not really to make fun of them or even to knock.
No, I'm not trying to make fun of them.
I'm not saying you are. I'm saying that my core motivation is to unearth a possible thesis that once you begin to treat the Bible as an artifact of a previous dispensation, which is what they're doing by creating a museum of the Bible. Once you put the book in a inaccessible time period that in many ways no longer applies according to the edicts of dispensationalism, then you do that with all archaeology past this date. And you, in some sense, equate all archaeology from that time. You equate the Bible with a series of magic texts. And now you're just looking for, it's like the search for the Ark of the Covenant. You're just looking for the right talisman that creates the right alchemical formula.
What you're doing, you're looking for things that confirm the template, just like your scientists earlier are operating with very much the same sort of template.
And also, I can't help but think that there's an illicit quest for power there, because you don't go digging up tools of magic or mass destruction in an ancient time unless your intention is to have power over your fellow man.
Exactly.
Which is illicit power.
Exactly.
So in many ways, it is a prurient quest, no matter what you're doing.
Right. That's my whole fear with this story ever since I first read it, is precisely that this is a quest for power of some sort. And it's a quest for in their thinking, they're smart enough to think and know that extra biblical texts, Babylonian texts, apocryphal texts, and so on, have information that will flesh out their understanding of things, and this is why they're looking at it. I totally agree.
Which brings up the answer to the gentleman in the coffee shop, or it could have been at the Village Inn where we often went for breakfast.
Well, that's true too.
But to that gentleman today, I would just say read Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, because it isn't the magic that matters. It doesn't matter whether it's real. It's the belief in the magic that creates all the damage and all of the movement out there. If you have enough people chasing the conspiracy exists because there are people chasing it.
Right.
And it's funny how that works in psychology. Bass fishermen, I used to be an avid bass fisherman when I was in high school. And I don't do it anymore. But a bass fisherman, if he digs into there is a psychology of the fish. If he digs into the fish's behavior, the fish doesn't chase a lure because you drop it in the water and he's like, oh, cool, and hits it. He chases the lure because the lure simulates a fleeing fish. And the psychology is triggered in the fish of that fish is fleeing from me, therefore I must be chasing it. And he does. And it engages the part of him that tells him what's happening in the world. And so to a certain degree, the belief in the magic is its own operative force, which is more powerful than the magic ever was. I mean, the love spell or the spell for better crops or to curse your enemies, which in a world of free will may not work at all. But the problem is the belief in the magic is what corrupts. That controls you.
Yep, exactly. So, exactly. And I think that's not only operating with Hobby Lobby, but like I said, I think that given the circle of advisors that were around President Bush, and given his own family history and given his own proclivities, that this was very much one of the hidden motivations for that whole Iraq invasion. It was a quest for power. And I think it was a quest for power, not in the obvious senses that we all know, but it was a quest for power precisely of this sort. In other words, Hobby Lobby, as far as I'm concerned, is really the tip of an iceberg of a much wider phenomenon that's happening in the Middle East, from Egypt to Syria, Libya, Iran, southern Turkey, Saudi Arabia, all of these places where there are these types of interventions are peculiarly rife with archaeological digs that we don't hear anything about. You know, Saddam Hussein was digging up Iraq all over and hauling all this stuff to the Baghdad Museum because, you know, he fancied himself the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar. So there's another case of the magic itself possessing you to go out and do these things. I think the same thing was operative in Egypt. I think the same thing is operative in Syria. Dr. Heather Lynn, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's a PhD in archaeology, and she has been hammering home this idea that a lot of this archaeological digging is precisely for this sort of magical purpose. And interestingly enough, she has a small book out that she documents the involvement of some very big, very, very big name European families operating behind the scenes in a lot of these digs through a variety of corporate fronts. It's truly astonishing what she's managed to find.
Well, this issue of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was basically done.
Well, this issue of power is a particular area of interest of mine. Partly because I tell stories. And so for me, one of the keys to understanding human beings who go wrong and become the villain in a story is their quest for power. It seems to be universally a quest for power over other men.
Right.
And I read this quotation yesterday. You're probably already familiar with it, but you know Will and Ariel Durant, who gave us wonderful multi-volume history. Will Durant says, power dements even more than it corrupts, lowering the guard of foresight and raising the haste of action. And we certainly see that a lot today.
Absolutely.
This dementia that power seems to be putting on autocrats all over the world. Bringing that up, I have just a couple of micro topics to close off our episode today, and I'll tell you what they are. One is warp drive, and the other is DNA shenanigans. And I'll save the DNA shenanigans for last, because the DNA shenanigans will be a bit of a revelation. It'll be a story of something that's actually happened to me that if you'd have told me, I would have poo-pooed it and not believe you. But as you know, I've had my DNA tested and recently some rather eerie things have been occurring, and I just wanted to. I don't want to go all the way to going, I have a warning for our listeners, but I want to go to at least say, I've seen something that doesn't add up to me. It makes me wary. So I don't really have a question about it, but I bet you'll have a comment. So on the warp drive is where I have questions. So as you know, there was an article out, you may have covered it in your blog, but there was an article out in the CI News Reporter that talked about the fact that, one, they're speculating that they're going to have the warp drive done a lot sooner than we think.
Yes.
Secondly, we're talking about many times the speed of light, not just the speed of light.
Right.
And it sort of explains how the warp drive works, and it doesn't work by being a form of propulsion at all. It works by bending space-time around the object, and the object essentially free-falling within space-time.
Right.
Sometimes, again, you get a vibe. You're just trying to read between the lines, you get a vibe. And there's certain vibes that I picked up on I wanted to ask you about. So vibe number one is, are you familiar with the concept of the 10th man? Have you seen World War Z and heard that quote? All right. So a great movie, by the way, Brad Pitt. It's a zombie movie for people that don't like zombie movies. But so in World War Z, they tell you what this 10th man is. So they say, look, the state of Israel has this policy where if they have 10 people and 9 of them are in agreement that we're safe, this is not going to hurt us. We can now proceed accordingly. It is the duty of the 10th man to disagree and to hold the committee to an exploration of what if we're wrong. That even if he doesn't personally disagree, it is his duty to disagree because of the war that nearly wiped him out and ended the state of Israel. They can no longer, they were ill prepared. They can no longer afford to believe that something is safe. Now, this is not meant to be construed as support for what's going on in Israel right now, or
I would certainly hope not.
yeah, I'm not taking a position on Embassy Barbie and Ken or anything like that. But did I say that?
Yeah, you did, but I have to agree with you. It's just appalling. I just, geez.
I can't watch. But
no, I can't. I mean, shooting it unarmed. Come on.
Yeah, there's no. I mean, there are protests, and so we have snipers, and I'm like, okay,
yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, how does that work? Didn't we go down this road before? But anyway, go ahead.
We're just walking that by, like, yeah, that's what happened today in the news. Snipers took out some protesters. But anyway, no, for me, it's the Ken and Barbie thing. But the 10th man approach is also a legitimate approach to doing all kinds of analysis. I use it in business. I occupy the position of 10th man in a business of which I'm partial owner. It is my duty to be slightly paranoid about who can get us, where our back door is unguarded, where it's left open. And regardless of whether I think it's likely or real, it is my duty to point out and insist upon every vulnerability. That's the 10th man's duty. And it strikes me that a 10th man approach to science is what we're starting to see emerge. I could be wrong, but everywhere I see people willing to consider the possibility of the impossible and thereby advancing science. Case in point, the article we started the episode with is about somebody who said, well, that's an interesting question. How do we know there weren't civilizations, and how would we find
exactly
entertaining a 10th man theory in the area of warp drive? It's a 10th man approach to say, well, what if we could go faster than light and violate all the rules? What would that look like? How would it work? And thereby, they're actually making progress by throwing over the assumptions that we've all. So my first question is, are we witnessing, and if so, why, a cultural shift within science to a 10th man approach to science?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And case in point here, since you've put this in the context of warp drive, case in point that got all of this started is you had a 10th man scientist working for NASA by the name of Dr. Harold White. His nickname is Sonny, so he's also called Dr. Sonny White. And Dr. White, if you really dig into his background and kind of read up on him, he's one of these people, kind of like Nikola Tesla or Herbert Ives. If you really dig into the people that didn't like Einstein, look up Herbert Ives sometime. Physicist that was working for Bell Laboratories that just hated Einstein's theory and came up with all sorts of alternative ideas. I do think absolutely you're watching the emergence of a 10th man phenomenon in science, and particularly in physics, which is bubbling over with 10th men. Dr. White is one of them, because you have to have a 10th man point of view to do what he did. What he did is he took the paper that Dr. Miguel Alcubierre, the Mexican physicist, published, the warp drive paper, famous paper in 1994, I think it was, in the Journal of Physics. And he laid out the equations for warp drive, okay? And when it was published, there was this big hoopla that, oh, wow, some scientist has actually worked out the equations. And then after a couple of weeks, the hoopla died down and everybody started to say, oh, oops, his equations require a mass energy conversion on the scale of the planet Jupiter in order to make it work. Well, Dr. White looked at the paper, and in order to look at the paper and do what he did, you have to absolutely assume that this guy is a 10th man, because what he did is he went through the equations and said, okay, what if we change the metric? And the metric, basically metric, whenever you run into that phrase, if you're reading relativistic physics papers or things like that, the metric is basically the minimal lattice structure unit in the fabric of space-time. And Dr. Althusser had set that very large, all right? So Dr. White went in and said, well, what if we rework the metric here and see what we can come up with? And lo and behold, he recast all the equations and figured out, no, you don't need a metric that big. You can create a warp in the fabric of space-time with a much smaller mass energy conversion within the realm of human possibility. And when he did that, bang, immediately what happened was DARPA came out with, and I've talked about this many times on the website in the members area, DARPA came out and said, oh, well, if that's the case, we're setting the goal for the United States to be warp capable in 100 years. I think this was about 2004, 2005, somewhere in that time frame that DARPA came out and made that a public goal for their research. Immediately after DARPA did this, NASA followed suit by setting up a pilot project, testing aspects, laying out the technology tree, the different benchmarks that they would have to achieve in order to determine whether or not Dr. White's paper was valid or not. And of course, they put Dr. White in charge of it, and he's had some success. So in other words, you had a 10th man here that is now responsible for determining a national security goal for DARPA, and you had NASA set him up as the chief lead scientist for its project to investigate and create warp drive. And it's gotten to the point now, Daniel, that there are actually people, engineers, designing these ships. Okay. So yeah, it's going to happen much sooner than people think it will. I suspect that you're going to, it probably won't happen in our lifetimes, but I suspect it will happen very shortly thereafter. Because what has come out of his research and other NASA investigations, the EM drive and so on and so forth, is just absolutely astonishing. That the age of the chemical rocket, that's going to be as valuable to us as a Caravel would be for, traveling by ship from the United States to Europe today. It's going to be that obsolete, and it's going to be obsolete overnight. The problem is, if you have that technology, if you have the ability to do that, if you let that technology fall into the wrong hands, you can create unbelievably powerful planet-busting, star-busting weapons. And I think to a certain extent, the reason that all of this was suppressed for so long was precisely that they didn't have a mechanism in place to surveil everybody and make sure nobody was, building that sort of thing in their garage, so to speak. Now they have that technology in place. They've got the ability to do that. So now we're seeing all of these stories come out into the public eye, where 20 years ago it would have been hushed up and kept out of the mainstream news altogether. So I think this is another big part of the story. Everywhere I turn, Daniel, biology, chemistry, physics, even mathematics to a certain extent, every science that you look at, there are now 10th men. There are now people that are questioning the established orthodoxies and writing papers that you never would have seen, that never, ever would have seen the light of day even 10 years ago. That paper about ancient civilizations, global warming, and so on and so forth, that appeared in the Scientific American, that would never have appeared 10 years ago, ever. So I think you're seeing it, and I think it's absolutely healthy.
Okay, so I'm going to make a comment about that, and then I'm going to ask you the rest of the warp drive questions just for the sake of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you'll be able to take them all on. So the comment is that I want to suggest that the 10th man meme may be a useful one for sort of the alternative research community to take on, because instead of being sort of hostile to traditional schools of inquiry, you're finding traditional schools of inquiry are independently developing their own sort of alternative lines of inquiry.
Right, exactly.
So rather than sort of be at odds with them, constantly sort of saying, they're not doing a good job, I think maybe more people in the alternative research community, if it can be called that, I think you've used that term, and I don't know a lot of their names, but you've talked about them before, could basically take on that 10th man meme of, hey, let's serve that role in the culture. Let's ask, what if that's wrong? What would that being wrong possibly look like? And then, it becomes, it seems to engage the scientific mind in a way that other things don't.
I've been attempting more or less to do that in my books because, for example, the Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men book, I was not in that book relying solely upon ancient texts. In fact, it was my intention deliberately at the outset to see if those texts could be correlated or squared in some fashion with the current contemporary scientific theory and thinking, particularly in genetics and genetic history, and so on and so forth. So in other words, I was on two tracks with that, and I've been on two tracks, ever since I started this series of books, to see, well, here's the alternative theory. Does any of this make sense with what the scientists themselves are saying? And some of the correlations, particularly in that particular book, some of the correlations were rather astonishing. They were much more exact than I ever thought that they would be. So maybe this turn that is going on in the sciences will start to open up some discussion, because I'm in agreement with you. The alternative research community has been operating, with certain exceptions like Dr. Rupert Sheldrake and people like that, has been operating in its own kind of isolation, and it really hasn't advanced things very well.
I had a second coming off of mute there. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and give you the warp drive questions. So, the first one is, could the first use of warp drive destroy our world? And the reason I ask that is because you picture that somebody says, hey, in a controlled experiment using vast amounts of resources and energy, we're going to bend space-time here on Earth. And I'm thinking, I mean, yes, I get that you could probably put that thing out there in the solar system and then do it, or you could put it on the moon and then do it, or you could launch from Mars. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. But in the end, you're still pretty close to us if you're going to be bending space-time. I'd prefer if you bent space-time if you were as far as the farthest star could be. And I do remember the furor over the super collider when they turn it on. Is it going to kill us all? Or Y2K? Are the robots going to take over and we're all going to go Terminator? I think you could probably correlate gun sales to the Y2K event, people buying C rations. And being a computer user at the time, I was avidly rolling my eyes because, I mean, I used some of the earliest computers before they were in boxes. And I remember people talking about this. Yep, one day we're going to have to redo all these computers because we didn't allow for a year 2000. That's a long ways off. This is, this is the 80s or the 70s. Depends on which computers you mean. But I still wonder. So first question is, could the first use destroy our world? Because after all, they are bending space-time. Number two, isn't an evacuation, is it actually a one-time use, destroy us all and leave us forever evacuation ship? And I ask this because, number one, a 10th man approach to science can actually imply panic. It can imply like the Bay of Pigs fiasco, where you're sitting there going, I need all solutions on my desk right away, anything, no matter how wild and crazy, put it on my desk because we got to get out of here. And correlate that with changes in the environment and changes in DNA. Like, who do we put on the darn boat? We can only hold 500 people, And we know Barbie and Ken are getting on, but, they just had this thing in Israel. So, but who else, And so they're the ultimate couple. Can you imagine if all our genetic children looked like Barbie and Ken? Yeah, everybody knows who I mean. But no, but anyway, the evacuation ship that is simply disposable, because once you warp space-time, planet Earth is done. I kind of get that vibe that they're trying to get the hell out of here and that they're worried about something. Number three, all this space and all of this stuff about looking for ET. I'm like, that's cool, but we were looking for ET since SETI, and why now? And then all of this mineral stuff, it's like, we can mine asteroids. We don't have to send manned missions. What are you going to do? Send a bunch of guys up there that spent all their lives studying to be astronauts, and suddenly they're going to dig mines. So
let me throw another ingredient into this pie you're baking here.
Not my pie, I'm just asking.
Yeah, right. Remember the change that has happened in the last 10 years in the so-called search for extraterrestrial life. And I'm not talking about CSETI, the actual program. I'm just talking about the general phenomenon.
Yeah,
what's been going on? What they're doing is they are studying, deliberately looking for Earth-like planets in other solar systems.
Yeah, well, you can tell they're saying that they're doing that. Yes. And for me, that would beg the question of, if we're searching for other intelligent life out there, maybe it's because the 500 people we send up there can't survive without finding at least some other people to plug in with.
Well, either that or it's
a colony in space.
Either that or it's part of your evacuation scenario. But I just wanted to.
Well, that's what I mean. But yeah, so for all of the above. So the first question has to do with, is it going to destroy the world and be a one-time use thing? Secondly, is it in fact a panicky evacuation ship? And does that explain some of the 10th man phenomenon we're starting to see in the sciences, including the search for maybe ancient information? Number three, from the articles that we see coming out about how they're accelerating this, which should also be a clue to the panic, if that's panic, because there's no reason. Another technology, we would spend a lot of time getting it right. We're not in a space race against the Soviets. There's no reason to hurry the heck up and get it done as fast as possible unless we're scared of something. So, but number three is, all of these articles imply, without saying it, a secret military industrial space program. It seems to be a given, no? Because, and by military industrial, I'm using Eisenhower's words, but I really mean military/commercial, jointly operating.
Right.
And, we now use commercial instead of industrial.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. So we should be calling it the military commercial complex. But so the question is, it literally is that. Isn't a military industrial space program, though they seem to have every intention of pretending there's not one, isn't it a given? I mean, everything they're doing makes it pretty damned obvious to a rational, intelligent person without any need for a conspiracy.
Hey, I've been talking about this subject, secret space programs, for 10 years.
Yeah, but you're crazy. So we that's different. No, I'm kidding. So the fourth question is this. If we're talking about warp engines and we're talking about bending space-time, and quantum entanglement at a macro level is a reality, then it's going to create some it potentially could create an equal and opposite reaction someplace else. And so by that definition, isn't a warp engine potentially in a macro, in a spooky action at a distance universe, isn't a quantum engine like that, a warp engine like that, essentially an astrological drive?
Yeah.
It is a work literally of objectified magic.
Gotcha.
So that's my questions.
All right, wonderful
We'll
question.
do a whole show with this.
Yeah, you could. First question: would it destroy the world? No, I don't think so, because you'd have to do the calculations, but using Dr. White's metric, you would still have to create a pretty huge. You'd have to create a pretty huge lattice defect in that warp in order to destroy the planet, and that would probably be beyond the energy. I haven't done the calculations, but my guess would be that it'd probably be beyond the energy required. And the second part of that is they have already created space warps at a local laboratory level. And what do I mean by that? You can go on phys.org and look up papers where scientists have performed experiments where they have removed micro events from the timeline. In other words, they've created a space warp. They've created a little bubble around these micro events. It's already happened. And it hasn't destroyed the world. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is it's, once again, the scale of the phenomenon. And in order to do that with planet Earth, you'd have to have a very, very large energy input. I do think that you could destroy significant regions of the planet, with one blow. But that technology on a planetary scale would have to be pretty large. To blow up a planet, I think you'd have to do something different. It would be kind of a warp technology, but in a different way. You'd have to create longitudinal warps. In other words, a wave of warps in order to do that. And possibly you could do that with the technology that Dr. White is thinking about. Possibly. That's a possibility.
I just keep hearing Charlton Heston saying, "You maniacs, you blew it all up." In front of a stinking Statue of Liberty,
Yeah, I can hear Charlton Heston, yes.
As we devolve into the next ape species that
yes, exactly.
There you go.
All right, question number 2, the evacuation ship. This Daniel, your intuition here is exactly the same as mine, because it appears to me as well that these global kleptocrats, elites, oligarchs, plutocrats, whatever you want to call, Catherine calls them Mr. Global, whatever these people are up to, and they're up to something, they're in an awful big hurry to get it done. And the question is why, and they're not telling. The evacuation ship idea intrigues me immensely because this 100-year timeline, when DARPA first announced it, this was back when George Ann Hughes was alive, and she called me up and asked me if I'd heard about that, and I said yes. And we talked privately. We didn't do a show on it. We talked privately, and this was what she was thinking, and this is what I was thinking at the time, that they're in an awful big hurry to get the heck out of here, and chemical rockets ain't going to do the job. So they've got to have a radical approach to taking a significant number of people off this planet for whatever reason. Now, what intrigues me here is my friend Richard Hoagland's idea. He's written over the years since his first book came out about the ruins on Mars, and then his second book, and then several papers on his website over the years. He has raised the possibility, based on various myths, scientific theories, and so on, that humanity was seeded on this planet from somewhere else, namely from Mars, which is very interesting to me because our circadian rhythms, I don't know if you know what they are, but human circadian rhythms are not plugged into the natural rhythm of the planet Earth. Our circadian rhythms are actually Martian. Okay, in other words, our natural sleep cycle is for a slightly longer day, the Martian day, rather than the Earth day, which is probably why my sleep cycle is so messed up. But anyway, things like that he's pointed out over the years. And he's even stated on one occasion, one of his most famous interviews, or actually documentaries, where he says we may well discover that we are the Martians. And when I first met Mr. Hoagland, I told him, I said, you know about the Dogon, the tribe in Africa, don't you? And he says, no. And I said, well, they and the Zulus, the Zulu tribe in Africa, just comes right out and tells you, yeah, we came here from Mars on a Merkaba, which is interesting because that's also a Hebrew word, and it just happens to mean ship. Okay. And, little things like this that you find all over the world. So I've entertained the idea publicly and in our members' vid chats that the biblical flood, this idea of a planetary wide flood, there's only one planet in the solar system where the evidence suggests a planet-wide flood. And it ain't Earth, it's Mars. Okay? It's Mars. So I've suggested the idea, all right, what if this Noah's Ark story isn't about building a big wooden ship and piling lots of animals into it and cleaning up their poop for 40 days and nights? What if it's about a much more sophisticated idea where the samples of DNA are what you are taking on the ship so that you can then clone them when you get to wherever it is you're going? Now, interestingly enough, what I find extremely odd is this push in recent years by private companies, by the government, by universities, by medical experiments to collect everybody's DNA. And I have to wonder why. Why do they want this DNA? I can think of several scenarios. But one of them might be is if you are planning some sort of evacuation from the planet in a big ship, it's going to be impossible to take 7 billion people with you, but you might be able to take 7 billion DNA samples in a petri dish, so to speak, with you. So, I'm speculating wildly on your wild speculation, but I put nothing past these people. I really don't. Third question, does this accelerating development indicate the existence of a secret space program? I absolutely think so. To me, I think the evidence is very clear and has been clear. If you look at the documents, if you look at the vast amount of money that's gone missing, that doesn't show up in the public economy as any sort of inflation and so on and so forth, it's just disappeared. It's like it's gone off world, which I think quite literally it has in the form of funding a vast research project that's led up to this. What we're seeing now are the stories that are, to my mind, Daniel, appear like, again, Umberto Eco's deliberate planting of memes in society to prepare people for upcoming technological developments. This is exactly what I think is really going on. So I'm totally agreed with you there. It smacks of secret space program, and part of that program, just like the public program back with the Brookings Institute study in the late 1950s, part of that report suggested in order for the space program to work, we are going to have to do a massive amount of social engineering to prepare people for the vast changes in human society that inevitably this is going to produce. So there was a deliberate covert social engineering program just with the public space program. And I think that indicates that the chances of there being a similar covert program for the covert program are much, much larger. And that's what I think, to a certain extent, we're witnessing. Number 4, does this have the potential to create, would a warp drive by dint of the phenomenon of entanglement create an entangled effect somewhere else? Bingo. I think you are spot on here. And the reason I think that is it would stand to reason from the physics, because essentially, if you can imagine all of space-time like a giant crystal with a lattice structure, when you introduce a defect in that lattice structure, like a warp does, when you grow crystals on Earth, crystals are grown on Earth, and they grow in response to the local properties of space-time. This is why crystals have different lattice structures in different places that they're grown on Earth. And that's why they grow them in outer space in zero gravity, to eliminate those lattice defects. So in other words, crystals are a record of local minute warps in space-time. So now let's imagine the whole of space-time as a regular lattice structure with no crystal lattice defects. When you create a warp bubble in that crystalline structure, what it's going to do is it's either going to skew or twist. Those are the two types of lattice defects in crystals. It's going to skew or twist the lattice structure in the rest of the crystal. In other words, it could result in a similar defect taking place somewhere else in the crystal as it attempts to adjust itself, which is what you find in crystals. So I think you're spot on here. There is even a, as I recall, in Star Trek: The Next Generation series, there was even an episode where they were talking about precisely these types of effects of warp drive engines that were long-lasting effects on the structure of space-time. So it's interesting to see that this comes out in Gene Roddenberry, you know, in his series, because Roddenberry, of course, had lots of connections with NASA. So, you know, maybe he's reflecting something they were already thinking on. Good questions. Excellent questions.
Thanks. Well, it also, I think, stands to reason that if you're going to bend space-time here, it's got to create something on the destination end as well.
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
So that, in essence, depends on quantum entanglement to a certain degree.
Yep.
So, though I don't pretend to understand.
Well, let me
quantum physics, quantum mechanics very well.
Let me clarify what you've just said. Because in standard relativistic theory, if you travel at the speed of light, say, for a year, and then come back to planet Earth, you're going to discover that everybody has aged several years. Because time is passing much faster for them than it is for the person traveling on a speed of light ship. Warp drive is different because through the phenomenon of entanglement, I think what will happen, and again, I'm guessing here, but because of the phenomenon of entanglement, once you shut it off, the time entanglement snaps you back into the same time as when you left. That's my guess. But, you know, I'd have to sit down and look very carefully at what Dr. White is doing. But I think you're going to find that to be the case because, again, it's that twisting of the lattice structure. You're stressing the lattice structure. When you turn it off, the structure snaps back into the same position that it was before. And in this case, the same position means the time element of the coordinate. So, yeah. That's my guess.
I wish I could get on a ship that would travel backwards in time because it's not that I would go back to the 50s or something, but I could get a really good deal on a brownstone, and I would like to change my economic situation.
Yeah, you want to live in Manhattan. That's what you want.
I'll never own a house here, but you know, if I could just get on that ship going backwards, even a couple of decades, I could make several wise real estate investments with my pocket. So almost anything, just the land. I don't care if they burn down. People are like, what happened if they burn down the house while you're traveling forward in time? I'm like, the land. That's all I have to have. But just keep it in my name, pay the property tax. In fact, burning it down might actually cheapen my taxes, so do it. Just wait till I'm gone. But I'll say one more thing about that, what we just talked about, and then I'll give the DNA stuff and we can wind up. So the that topic that we talked about earlier as being another anomalous comment in that article. Maybe not anomalous. I don't mean to make everything mysterious, but the article about asking the question, how do we know there's not, how would we know if there were ancient civilizations? It posited the idea that one way to do that would be off-world evidence, that if there were past industrialized civilizations, they might have entered space and their space junk may still be up there. Well, it strikes me that when you've got a sudden anomalous executive branch saying, let's go to Mars really quick, and you've got this acceleration, as well as simultaneously a journey back for ancient texts, you may have people that are trying to figure out where we came from, and whether or not, the key question would be whether or not it can be made habitable again. Is there still water there? Can we tap it? Can we terraform it? But it would, one area of knowledge, if we did come from off planet, that people would want to acquire is which planet.
Exactly.
All right, so I'm going to just mention some stuff about the DNA. Now, I'm not typically very paranoid about things. Ultimately, I have a talking office. I have Google Home, and I have Amazon Echo, and I have them all over the house. And yes, I know that you can now send audible signals to these devices that are outside the range of human hearing to control them. I know all of this, and I know that one can hack into my computer, and I'm on a computer now, and there's all kinds of things that I accept the risk just because I don't believe I'm the center of the epic and it to get me, like the van parked down the street. Do you see them? I just heard my telephone click. And it's like, what are you doing with a landline? Nobody has a landline. Even the federal government doesn't have landlines.
I have a landline. So quiet.
Well, but you're crazy. So no, I'm kidding. So look at that. Look at Gertha. That's all you got to do. You're iced tea craze. You got the wild eyes, the shifty cup, the shifty. It's all,
I'm perfectly calm. Thank you.
Addicted to Gertha.
Yeah.
Yeah, but right now your hair's all standing up underneath your hat. That's why you wear the hat. You can't see. They can't see it. So, right. But here's the thing. So they recently I did the DNA thing. I sent in my sample and I got a DNA service to give me both the health reports and the genetics reports. I had a lot of curiosities where I came from, and I got and what my health risks were for certain things, and I got a lot of really helpful answers and a bunch that weren't. But the stuff that gave me insight was useful. Glad I did it. And lately, though, several things happened. Number one is I got an email from somebody that's like, I'm your cousin, and I'd like to establish a relationship. I've sent you an invite, be my, connect with me, and let's swap the
holy cow.
Let's have a conversation. Now, this is normal.
Holy cow.
In these services, this is normal to the ones that do Ancestry. They have a setting that says, do you want to be found by other people that you're related to? And what do you want to share with them? Your name, your picture, your email address, all of your information, medical and Ancestry, or just Ancestry. Like, you can choose all of this.
I
was sharing Ancestry data. And so I thought, okay, this is normal. I'm not used to getting it in my email box. I'm used to, if I log into this thing, which I do like once a year, then I will see if there's any new invites or I've added any new cousins. And I don't want to contact my cousins. I don't want anything to do with these people. So I don't know them. And just because they're related by blood, maybe they're more likely to be crazy and serial killers. But I don't want to, I don't need that, right? But it was curiosity. Like, if somebody really close to me signs on, I might be like, oh, that's interesting. That famous wealthy uncle that is going to bequeath me his fortune. That would be cool.
Yeah.
So I can buy a brownstone. But the thing is I got this email from my supposed cousin. So the first thing I do is I log in to the system where those alerts normally come. And I thought, okay, I'll go to the alert section and see. Two things were curious about that. One is there was no alert from that cousin in the system when I logged in. And two,
holy cow,
that person was not flagged as my cousin or any other kind of relative in there. There was no such picture or person. So this came outside like some kind of scam, like somebody trying to get me to log in. But when I logged in, it tried to get me to agree to a new test. And it does this all the time. It presents you with, hey, we got a new medical test we're now approved to do. Do you want to test your DNA against that? We got a new Ancestry test. Do you want to test your... So normally I'm like, yeah, sure, give me the info. But when I logged in, the first thing I get is greeted with this test. So I skip it. And then I go into the the genealogy part, and this lady is not there, and neither is the alert or anything. So somehow somebody knew I was participating in this and sent me an email outside. Right? And so what I did is I went into my settings and immediately shut down, "You shall not share any of my genealogical information with anybody, no matter how closely they are related." And I changed my last name to be my initial and just stuff like that, you know. And I don't know. And so I kind of zipped it up. And then I noticed that all of these other genealogy databases that I had used to test my sample started sending me new tests and updates and log, "We haven't seen you in a while, your stuff." And I'm like, okay, that's interesting, because you never hear from them. They're free. What you used to do is the FDA had barred the medical testing ones from giving you the information, because they were taking your money, and giving you the information seemed like giving you medical advice and taking your money for it. And so they were barred from doing it. But not so these nonprofit ones that said, "Hey, upload the sample, give a $5 donation." And so you upload a digital version of your sample that you get from the main sampler after you sample it, and we'll give you the medical reports they're not allowed to give you. So I did all of that, and I was in some databases. Well, they all started emailing me at once, and I'm just like, all right, this is weird. And then I saw a news story, and the news story said that they just used DNA evidence I had heard it verbally from somebody, and then I looked it up and saw it. They used DNA evidence to identify the Golden State Killer, the serial killer. Yes. And what he had done was he had done his DNA test, paid his money out of the same kind of curiosity, but then he had uploaded his sample to one of these free nonprofit databases that give you the extra info, and that's how they got him. The law enforcement, because he didn't pay, his privacy wasn't protected in the same way, so they were able to get a warrant, get that DNA data, and then get a DNA match and a profile for who they think this guy is, right, and stalk him down. And as soon as and all of these shenanigans that I started to experience date to when they did that. As though somebody decided, not me personally, but somebody decided, hey, everybody connected to the system, let's go ahead and just get them to agree to new tests, update their profile within all of these sites, and the ones we can get access to, and let's create like a mythological person that they can share their stuff with, who they think is a relative who is really just one of our drones, and they voluntarily give it the data. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not trying to create a weird paranoid conspiracy here, but in a way, all of this happened at once. It's just too coincidental to be a complete accident. Right. And definitely when somebody with a name and a face is sending me multiple emails trying to get me to share my data and connect with them, and they're not a real person, that's suspicious just on its face. So the point that I want to make is that to read the privacy statements of these DNA things very carefully, and maybe think twice about using the free ones that don't charge you anything, and maybe think twice about sharing your data with stranger relatives that may or may not be your cousin, and maybe think twice about clicking on emails that contain this stuff. I don't want to create any fear. I still want to know what's in my DNA profile, especially so I can predict my health. I know now how I will probably die. There are multiple indicators that tell me if it's going to get you, it'll probably be this or this. And I'm like, okay, now I know. I'm glad I'll be ready. But I'm American. I don't change my behavior. I don't try to avoid it. I'm just like, okay, yep, I'm going to keep eating these Fritos. They're going to kill me, but at least I know now. No, but I just wanted to bring it up because there are very few instances where something happens to me personally, like the clicking on the phone line, that I would bring up in the show that I thought had the integrity to bring it up. But I thought this was suspicious enough. I ought to mention it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Let me tell you what my suspicion is about all. I'm getting feedback.
Yeah.
I've been suspicious for a long time about all of these Ancestry.com and things to get people to send in their DNA. The latest gimmick is they're coupling DNA to Bitcoin. Send us your DNA and this will be your collateralized, it's insanity, but it's just another way to get people to give their DNA. Then let's add to this that about a year or so ago, I read a story, I even blogged about this, I've talked about this in some vid chats. I talked about this at the 2015 Secret Space Program conference. They now have the technology in the hands of certain law enforcement agencies, the FBI being one of them, some local law enforcement agencies, to sequence your DNA in the field. In other words, they take the sample, they don't have to send it off to the lab for, analysis. They can actually sequence it in the field and get results with, right there in the field within an hour or so. Then let's add to this, there are these reports from around the country, largely in the Southwest, California, Arizona, places like that, but other places in the country where they are actually stopping people, at these checkpoints on the highway, ostensibly, to make sure you're not driving drunk, but they're insisting they take a DNA swab. So they are collecting DNA right and left. And I suspect that they are putting that into databases for various purposes, biological warfare, genetically modified biological warfare, pathogens, you name it. They may be doing medical tests for, genetic therapies and things of this sort. There's all sorts of explanations for it. But since we're talking about secret space programs and ancient technology and all those stories from the Bible to the Enuma Elish and Epic of Ninurta and so on, where you have indications.
Enema?
Enuma Elish.
Oh, okay, all right.
Not enema.
Like the Enema
Elish. No.
That's new. I haven't heard that term.
The Enuma Elish. It sounds like enema if you say it fast. But if you look at those stories, they all have some version that at some point a deliberate genetic modification occurred in humanity from the outside. Then years ago on this site, when we first got it up and running, I also blogged about a story where geneticists in Europe were doing genetic studies of the various royal houses in Europe, particularly the Habsburgs, and looking at their DNA, House of Windsor, the Hohenzollerns, so on and so forth, doing genetic studies of these royal families. And I had to wonder, what's this about? And putting it all together, Daniel, and I'm going to walk way out, as I usually do, onto the end of the twig of speculation here and mention yet another suspicion I've had for a long time. And that is the public story, the public version of the story of the cracking, the discovery of the double helix by Watson and Crick. Because that was made possible on the basis of a biologist, a lady that had taken pictures with an electron microscope in Germany that allowed them to figure out the sequencing of the helix. She played a crucial role, very unknown part of the story. I got to thinking, if this is the case, why wasn't it discovered earlier? It's like the laser. The physics for the laser was there in the 1930s. Why did it take 30 years for somebody to come up with a laser? Well, I happen to think that they did much earlier and for some very diabolical purposes. But add it all together, take all of it all together, and it appears to me, Daniel, that they're looking for something with all of this DNA activity. They're looking for something. And one of the things I think they might be looking for is some sort of genetic confirmation of those ancient stories. Because if you read those ancient stories carefully, and I'm going back to something I said earlier about that Magic 12 document and the curious statement it makes about there being a higher order unification of biology and physics such that the humanoid life form appears to be the most adapted to intelligent life. In other words, if intelligent life arises, it's going to have some version of this. Okay. If you look at those stories, those ancient stories, one of the things that is almost universal in all of them, not completely universal, but almost, is that the off-worlders look like us, walk like us, talk like us, and in order for their genetic experimentation program to have worked in the first place, they had to have been genetically similar to us from the get-go. In other words, we have, as I've always said, we've got genetic cousins out there of the genus Homo sapiens that are close enough genetically that makes an interbreeding and subsequent reproducible population possible, kind of like lions and tigers, ligers, that makes it possible. And the only way then that you would be able to detect a continued presence of those people here on Earth would be genetically. And that's one of the things that I think they're looking for. It's the only thing that makes sense to me, given everything else I've read about this secret space program and what the post-war national security establishment may, in my estimation, have thought that they might have been confronted with. So I suspect that this is part of the plan. But even if that's not true, if you add everything together that they're doing, they are looking for something. What it is, that may be it. It may be something completely different. But I absolutely think that they're looking for something, a genetic marker of some sort.
Well, because we need Nazis in every show, I have to say that it could be they're just looking for purity. And
oh, please.
They're just trying to find the Barbie and Ken in all of us.
Listen, that's a joke. That you're joking, but what disturbs me is well, listen, the eugenics movement, that whole attitude, I still think is there among at least the Western elites. I think that that's still there to some degree.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
It's very subtle. It's very subtle, and unless you're looking for it, you don't see it. But I definitely think it's still there with some of these people. And again, they may be looking for some sort of genetic purity, because the reason I say that is that when Dr. DeHart and I were writing the transhumanism book, we were just baffled at all the weird stuff that we were finding. And we found this bizarre ancient idea of the masculine androgyne. And I know that sounds oxymoronic and totally counter to the current sort of new age fascination with the mother goddess and all of that stuff. We found exactly the opposite thing once we started really digging into some of these ancient ideas. So having found that, we started looking for, is this what the government's up to with all of this genetic research? So Dr. DeHart, he was at my apartment and we were working on the book, and he was searching online, and then all of a sudden I heard him say, holy, what? He says, come and look at this. And I came over to his computer, and he had pulled up the Oak Ridge laboratory website. and he had found, this just blows my mind to this day, he had found a page where the Department of Energy was sponsoring genetic studies in alcoholism, the ability to wiggle your ears, the ability to curl your tongue, homosexuality, and some other thing. It was just this weird list of traits that they were looking for genetic markers of. They
found him. It's Jeff Sessions. He's got he can do all of that stuff.
Well, he
You know,
probably
there.
can. Maybe
look down.
he's a Department of Energy experiment. I don't know.
He is. You got to watch. He's fast too. You got to have a
but there was this weird list of stuff that made absolutely no sense, that they were looking for genetic markers for all of this stuff. So clearly they're studying genetic markers in fine detail. And
well, a lot of this stuff correlates, because having done the DNA thing, there are some pretty bizarre things, like your eyes are more likely to see yellow more clearly. I mean, there's just bizarre stuff. You're more likely to taste bitter when you taste coffee than you are sweet. There are these things that are in there that they know from the DNA because somebody's done a test, and they may or may not correlate to another factor. But by searching for one, you could search for the other. But I think these are not necessarily mutually exclusive theories. I mean, I would say that the search for purity is always a matter of expedience. It's always purity for a purpose. So when the Nazis were searching for purity, they were trying to build a state, and their definition of purity upheld that. And they were trying to build an occult state, and it didn't even really match, because by definition their Führer wasn't even pure enough.
No, it wasn't.
But it was a pragmatic purity. And so if you're trying to build a profile of who the purest DNA were for the purpose of landing off, putting them in an escape vessel, and having only 1,000, say, be able to make it off the planet before it's burned up, you definitely would, maybe using modern technology, you'd probably want to know the DNA profile, know if it's a guy like me that's going to die of X, Y, and Z, or is more.
Well, I'm not saying that I'm not
a megalomaniac,
Well, I'm not saying that there's not plenty of innocent explanations for all this. There are.
No, I don't mean innocent, but I mean the difference between an Aryan and a Martian is just whatever criteria you're looking for. Convince yourself you have pure.
This is the problem that Scott and I, when he found that strange bridge site, the immediate thing that popped into our mind is, this is looking like some sort of eugenics thing in careful disguise. Oh, brown eyes. Brown eyes was the other marker. They were looking for some sort of correlation between brown eyes and disease.
Well, I understand that we are superior to everyone without brown eyes.
Yes, we've got,
perfectly logical.
Yes, perfectly. I get so tired of that stuff, because if there's any race that's genetically messed up, it's Caucasians. But anyway, it's just that it looks to me like underneath all of the public explanations, there's something else going on. It has that same feel that, to me, that you experience with all of this sudden talk of and promotion of warp drive. It has the same feel to me. They're looking for something, and they're not telling us exactly what it is that they're looking for, because all of these studies seem to be going in the direction that they're looking for some sort of ancient marker that's present. And we've already had indications of that, with their theories about mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosomal Adam, and so on and so forth. So trace it forward a bit, and you get the idea that maybe they're also looking for the marker, if any, of that intervention that so many ancient texts talk about. So I don't know, but that's my best guess.
Well, it's been another rip-roaring show. I'm worn out.
I am too. Thank you. Very, very good questions. Very, very interesting, intriguing questions.
Thanks. I worked hard on it, and
I'm sure you did.
Throwing new stuff. I liked being able to do the machine gun approach. Are they planning an escape pod, and is there a secret program?
Well, I think you have to conclude that there was a secret program.
Yeah,
simply by the examination of what happened in 1947. With the establishment of the national security state, the Roswell episode, all of this stuff taking place in 1947, and then the persistence of the same people in the intelligence military community that are connected with spy satellites, with the UFO study groups, and so on and so forth. It's the same group of people all the time. And then you have massive amounts of money that over the years have gone missing, and the amounts of money are too big to write off to covert political action, slush funds, or any of this stuff. It's an amount of money that would be required if you're going to research these types of technologies, which is exactly what I think they've been doing.
Well, Dr. Farrell, I'm surprised at you, because whatever it takes to support our Space Force and our troops.
Oh, jeez.
that's what we have to give them.
Talk about another either half-ass slip of the tongue or deliberate message. We need another one. Whoa, Don. We have a Space Force, and you want another one, or what's going on here?
I don't even think it matters if it's made up, because they'll do it now that it's been said.
Yeah, precisely. It's just.
Oh, we need another one. Okay, let's get right on that.
Yeah, let's get right on that. Thanks, Mr. Reagan. It's just, there's so many indicators that this has been going on for decades. And now I think it's getting to the point that it's coming right out into the open. Asteroid mining, space mining, that implies off-planet commerce. And the moment you say that, then it makes it very clear why the Germans are wanting to build out a 4G network on the moon. It's just all sorts of strange stories that, put the dots together, folks. And what are they telling you? Yeah, we're out there, and we're gonna go public with it pretty soon.
Well, Dr. Farrell, I don't understand your prejudice toward the Germans, because they, in 1917, they messed up a little bit, and in the 1930s they messed up a little bit. But what's wrong? We've all gotten over it. What's wrong with having the Germans plant their flag first on, a new territory like the moon for a greater, a new Germany? What's wrong?
Listen.
And a pure Germany.
Yeah, a pure Germany on the moon.
On the moon.
On the moon. Well, it reminds me.
Science fiction. It's been done. Nazi surfers from the moon.
You need to watch the movie Iron Sky if you haven't watched it.
I've seen it. Horrible. I couldn't get past it. I was like, God, this is.
Oh, it's campy. It's deliberately campy. The part that I love is the Wagner being played in the limousine on the xylophone. I love that. No, the Eagle has landed July 20th, 1969. The Eagle has landed. You know what that was the 25th anniversary of?
No.
The foiled bomb plot against Hitler.
Oh.
Whose Eagle is landing here,
That was the one Ravenscroft was involved in, right? Or not Ravenscroft, but what's the name of they made a movie with
Stauffenberg.
Stauffenberg. Yeah. Well, I just think it's time to let the Germans invade something new. It's been a long time.
Oh, jeez.
What they do. See, I discovered something, Dr. Farrell, that in my DNA ancestry, that my people, they're from the northernmost part of Germany, and they're from the Celtic area. They were North European, and they were Celtic and British, but the northernmost part, they were North German, and they were a little bit Viking, and they were like, a little bit up in that.
That explains so much. So,
this love of Wagner that I have, it's really just coming back to my roots,
Yeah, right. My German blood is from the southern part of Germany. If anyone has the Wagner blood in him, it's me, and I don't listen to Wagner.
Well, so did you get that one where it says if your ears are can wiggle your ears, then you're more likely to invade Poland than not?
Oh, jeez, no, I didn't get that one, Daniel.
That'd be an odd.
If that, jeez,
I didn't expect it. I didn't even ask that question.
Daniel, I'm not voting for you if you run for chancellor for Germany. I'm just not doing it. I'm sorry.
What about Chancellor of the United States? Because it's only a matter of a few more months.
Yeah, right.
We'll have a Reichschancellor.
Yeah,
we got to have our Reichstag fire first, but unless that's already happened.
Oh my. Jeez.
I just want a brownstone. That's all. I don't want world domination.
Yeah, right. Uh-huh.
Well, this has been fun. We'll get this up in the members section. I hope the people enjoy putting up with us for yet another 3 hours.
Yep, I'm sure they will.